The red grease pencil in Elena Vance's hand snapped with a sharp, dry pop at exactly 0414 on a Tuesday morning, leaving a jagged crimson streak across the structural schematics of the General's new three-story Tactical Operations Center at Fort Calloway. The sound was small, lost beneath the low, rhythmic hum of the HVAC system in the temporary engineering trailer, but to Elena, it sounded like a structural failure. She didn't curse. She didn't even sigh. She simply set the two broken halves of the pencil down on the edge of the drafting table, her fingers steady despite the 14th hour of her shift. Outside, the Georgia humidity was already beginning to thicken, a heavy, invisible curtain draped over the pine trees, and the sprawling construction site of what was supposed to be the crown jewel of the base's modernization initiative. Elena looked at the crimson line she'd drawn. It ran directly through the load-bearing column designated as C12, the pivot point where the new steel skeleton of the command and control hub met the reinforced concrete of the old Cold War-era bunker beneath it. To anyone else, the connection was a marvel of modern retrofitting. To Elena, it was a lie. She was a chief warrant officer too, a dirt warrant in Army parlance, someone whose job was to bridge the gap between the lofty visions of architects and the stubborn reality of the earth. She had grown up in Gary, Indiana, in a house where the walls groaned in the wind and her father spent his weekends pulling apart salvaged diesel engines just to see how the valves timed their dance. Elena hadn't played with dolls. She had played with the discarded bearings and the copper wiring her father brought home from the scrapyard. By the time she was 12, she could tell if a truck engine was going to throw a rod just by placing her palm on the hood and feeling the hiccup in the vibration. It wasn't magic. It was a hypersensitivity to the language of physics, a form of synesthesia that turned structural tension into a low, humming frequency in the back of her skull. When a building was sound, it felt like a chord in C major. When it wasn't, it felt like a toothache. Fort Calloway was a symphony of toothaches. She stood up, her joints popping in the quiet trailer, and walked to the small, stained coffee maker in the corner. The pot was scorched, the liquid inside more like battery acid than breakfast, but she poured a mug anyway, the ceramic heat grounding her. She was 34 years old, her hair pulled into a bun so tight it felt like a structural component of her skull, and she had spent the last decade building runways in the middle of nowhere and bridges that had to hold 60-ton Abrams tanks. She didn't have a degree from West Point or a fancy civilian internship with a firm in Manhattan. She had a decade of mud under her fingernails and a record of never being wrong about the way weight moved through the world. She turned back to the table, looking at her hand-drawn wiring diagram, not of the electrical system, but of the stress paths. She had mapped the wiring of the gravity itself. It was a mess of lines and notations that looked more like a map of a nervous system than a construction plan. It showed where the weight of the massive third-floor server farm would push against the thermal expansion joints, and where the vibration of the industrial-grade HVAC units would create a harmonic resonance with the old bunker's foundation. The official blueprints, generated by a $6 million software suite used by the Corps of Engineers, said the building was over-engineered by a factor of 4. Elena's diagram, drawn with a red grease pencil and a ruler she'd had since basic training, said the building would fail the moment the internal temperature hit 94 degrees and the servers reached full load. The door to the trailer creaked open, admitting a blast of muggy air and specialist Sam Tug Taggart. Tug was 6'4", a former defensive end from a small college in Kentucky who had traded a potential NFL career for the seat of a D9 bulldozer. He was the only person on the site who didn't look at Elena like she was a ghost in the machine. He carried 2 breakfast burritos wrapped in foil that smelled like grease and salvation. He didn't ask her why she was still there. He just set a burrito on the edge of her drafting table and leaned over to look at the crimson streak on the vellum. "Still C12, Tug asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the small space. "It's not just the column, Tug," Elena said, her voice dry. She took a sip of the scorched coffee. "It's the way they've tied the secondary supports into the old slab. They're treating the bunker like it's bedrock. It's not bedrock. It's a 40-year-old concrete box that's been sitting in a high-water table for 4 decades. It's saturated. It's soft. They're building a cathedral on a sponge." Tug chewed his burrito slowly, his eyes tracking her red lines. He wasn't an engineer, but he knew how the ground felt under his treads. He knew when the soil was punchy and when it was tight. Captain Miller says the core samples came back at 5,000 psi. He showed the general the charts yesterday. They're starting the heavy lift of the generators at noon today. Elena felt the toothache in the back of her head flare. The core samples were taken from the north side tug, the dry side. They didn't sample the southwest corner because the drill rig couldn't clear the old ventilation stack. They interpolated the data. They guessed. They don't like it when you call it guessing, Chief, Tug said softly. They like to call it professional modeling. Professional modeling is just guessing with a prettier spreadsheet, Elena replied. She looked at the clock, 0430. In 3 hours, the site would be swarming with contractors, junior officers, and the ivory tower crowd from the regional headquarters. At the center of it would be Captain Miller, a man whose uniform was always perfectly pressed and whose belief in the infallibility of his software was absolute. Miller saw Elena as a relic, a holdover from an era where people built things by feel rather than by algorithm. He treated her with a polite, condescending deference that was more insulting than outright hostility. Elena didn't care about being insulted. She cared about the 300 soldiers who would be working in that building. She cared about the fact that the C2 hub was designed to be a hardened facility, which meant the windows didn't open and the doors were blast-rated. If the building shifted, if the frame racked by even 2 inches, those blast doors would jam in their tracks. It wouldn't be a building anymore. It would be a tomb. She finished her coffee and grabbed her hard hat, the white plastic scarred and faded from years of sun. Come on. I want to see the footings before they start the lift. The air outside was thick enough to chew. The construction site was a landscape of red Georgia clay, carved into deep trenches and topped with a forest of steel I-beams. The skeletal frame of the C2 hub rose up against the pre-dawn sky, a dark, geometric shape that looked sturdy and permanent. But as Elena walked toward it, she felt the familiar, uncomfortable buzz in her inner ear. It was the sound of the wind catching the upper beams, a vibration that felt just a fraction of a second too long. The steel was singing, and the song was out of tune. They reached the southwest corner of the foundation. The old bunker's concrete wall was visible here, a massive gray slab that had been power-washed and prepped for the new structural ties. Elena knelt in the red mud, ignoring the way it soaked into the knees of her ox. She reached out and pressed her bare palm against the concrete. Tug stood a few feet back, his arms crossed, watching her. He'd seen her do this a dozen times. She wasn't looking for cracks, not yet. She was listening. She closed her eyes, letting the noise of the waking base, the distant rumble of a truck, the chirp of a bird, fade into the background. She focused on the vibration traveling through the earth. The concrete felt cold and damp. And then she felt it, a rhythmic, infinitesimal shudder. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the traffic. It was the wiring of the building, the way the weight of the steel was already beginning to settle into the saturated concrete. The foundation wasn't pushing back with the equal and opposite force that Newton promised. It was yielding. It was a slow-motion collapse that would take weeks to finish but had already begun. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. "Feel what?" Tug asked, stepping closer. "The ground, it's breathing, Tug, it shouldn't be breathing." She stood up, her face pale in the twilight. She didn't need a sensor or a laser level, she knew. She walked to the temporary stairs and climbed to the second floor, her boots clanging on the metal grating. Tug followed her, his weight making the whole structure shimmy. Elena stopped at the junction of column C12. She pulled a small, high-intensity flashlight from her pocket and shone it on the weld where the new beam met the mounting plate. The weld was perfect. A smooth, rhythmic bead of steel that would have passed any X-ray inspection. But Elena wasn't looking at the weld. She was looking at the paint, specifically the industrial-grade gray epoxy that coated the beam. She leaned in close, the smell of curing concrete and wet metal filling her lungs. There, at the very edge of the mounting plate, was a hairline fracture in the paint. It was less than a millimeter long. It looked like a stray hair. "Tug, look." Tug leaned in, squinting. "I don't see nothing, Chief." "Look at the shadow," she said, her voice tight. "The paint is flaking, not peeling, flaking. That means the steel underneath is stretching. It's under more tension than the epoxy can handle. This beam is already at its limit, and they haven't even put the floor slabs in yet." "Maybe it's just the temperature," Tug suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. He knew Elena didn't see ghosts. "It's 0500. This is the coolest the building will be all day. If it's stretching now, what happens when the sun hits that south-facing wall and the steel expands another eighth of an inch? What happens when they crane those 3-ton generators onto the roof?" She stood up, the toothache now a full-blown migraine. She knew what she had to do, and she knew exactly how it would go. She would present her findings. She would show them the wiring diagram of the stress. She would point to the flake of paint and the saturated soil, and they would look at her with that mixture of pity and annoyance that had defined her career since she pinned on her first bar. At 0800, the engineering briefing began in the main trailer. The room was cooled to a crisp 68 degrees, and the air smelled of floor wax and expensive coffee. Captain Miller stood at the head of the long table, a laser pointer in his hand, projecting a 3D model of the building onto the wall. Beside him were two civilian contractors from Vanguard Engineering, men in polo shirts and chinos who looked like they'd never gotten their boots dirty. At the back of the room sat Colonel Hedges, the base commander, a man whose primary concern was the operational readiness date and the budget. Elena stood by the door, her muddy ox a stark contrast to the clean uniforms in the room. She held her grease pencil diagram, rolled up like a scroll. "As you can see from the latest stress test simulations," Miller said, his voice smooth and confident, "the C2 hub is well within the safety margins for the generator lift. We've accounted for the harmonic load of the cooling fans and the weight of the UPS battery arrays. We are green for the lift at 1200. Colonel Hedges nodded, tapping a pen against his chin. "Good, we need this facility live. The Pentagon is breathing down my neck about the network integration." Elena stepped forward. The movement was quiet, but the room went still. They all knew her. They all knew she was about to say something that would slow them down. "Colonel, I have a concern regarding the structural integrity of the C12 junction and the Southwest Foundation," Elena said. Her voice was level, devoid of emotion. She didn't sound worried. She sounded like a mechanic explaining why a brake line was about to fail. Captain Miller closed his eyes for a brief second, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Chief Vance, we've reviewed your notes from last week. The software has already run the numbers on those load paths. The bunker slab is rated for double the current weight." "The software is using the core samples from the north side, Captain," Elena said. She walked to the table and unrolled her diagram over the 3D projection. The red grease pencil lines looked crude and violent against the clean digital model. "I took manual measurements of the soil saturation this morning. The water table has risen 4 inches since the last survey. The concrete in the southwest corner is weeping. It's losing its structural bond with the soil." One of the civilian contractors, a man named Henderson, let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Chief, with all due respect, you're talking about feelings and weeping concrete. We're talking about finite element analysis. The model accounts for soil variance. Does your model account for the fact that the epoxy is already shearing off the C12 junction?" Elena asked, her eyes locking onto Miller's. "I was out there 3 hours ago. The steel is already in tension. If you put those generators on the roof today, you're going to exceed the shear strength of the mounting bolts on the second floor. The building won't just settle. It will rack." "The shear strength of those bolts is 10 times what's required," Miller said, his voice rising slightly. "Chief, I appreciate your on-the-ground perspective, I really do. It's what makes you a great warrant. But you're looking at a microscopic flake of paint and predicting a catastrophic failure. It's not supported by the data." "The data is wrong because the inputs are incomplete," Elena said. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't beg, she just stated the fact. "I've mapped the stress paths manually. Look at the diagram. The weight isn't moving down through the columns like it's supposed to. It's twisting. The building is trying to rotate toward the soft soil. When you add the generators, you're adding a rotational torque that the foundation can't counter." Colonel Hedges looked at the red-marked vellum and then at the 3D model. He looked like a man who wanted to believe the computer but was troubled by the woman who had never given him a reason to doubt her before. "Captain, what's the risk here?" "Sir, the risk is a delay," Miller said firmly. "If we stop the lift now, we lose the crane contract for 3 weeks. We miss the integration window. And for what? Because Chief Vance thinks she can hear the concrete failing? We have 3 independent engineering firms that signed off on these plans. We have the best software in the world. The building is safe." The colonel looked at Elena. "Chief, if you do this lift, Colonel, you'll have a structural failure within 48 hours. It might not be the whole building. It might just be the southwest corner. But once it starts, you won't be able to stop it, and there will be people inside." The silence in the room was heavy. Elena could feel the weight of their judgment. They saw a woman who was too close to the project, someone who was letting her intuition override the cold, hard facts of modern engineering. They saw a technician who didn't understand the big picture. I'm going with the data, Hedges said, turning back to the table. Captain Miller, proceed with the lift. Chief Vance, you're off the site for the day. Go get some sleep. You've been working too many hours. That's an order. Elena didn't move for a heartbeat. She felt the controlled rage, not a hot, explosive thing, but a cold, sharp blade settle in her chest. She had done her job. She had mapped the truth and laid it out for them to see. They had chosen the lie because it was more convenient. Yes, sir, she said. She rolled up her diagram, the paper crinkling under her fingers. She didn't look at Miller. She didn't look at the contractors. She walked out of the trailer and back into the sweltering Georgia heat. Tug was waiting by her Humvee. He saw the look on her face and didn't have to ask. They're doing it. They're doing it, Elena said. She threw her diagram into the back seat. They're doing the lift at 1200. What are we doing? Elena looked at the skeletal building, the toothache in her head now a thrumming roar. We're going to the motor pool. I need to check the calibration on the seismic sensors we use for the runway grading. Chief, the colonel told you to go to sleep. He told me I was off the site, Tug. He didn't say I couldn't be at the motor pool. She looked at him, her eyes hard. I'm not going to be at home when this thing starts to go. I'm going to be where I can measure exactly how wrong they were. The next 4 hours were a study in agonizing slow motion. Elena sat in the back of the motor pool office, a small, grease-stained room a quarter-mile from the construction site. She had a laptop open, hooked up to a pair of seismic sensors she'd quietly buried near the C2 hub months ago, a habit she'd picked up in Afghanistan, where the ground was as unstable as the politics. Tug sat beside her, drinking a soda and watching the live feed from the site's security cameras. On the screen, a massive 300-foot crane was unfolding its neck like a prehistoric bird. The generators, 4 massive olive-drab boxes the size of shipping containers, were lined up on flatbed trailers. They were the heart of the facility's redundant power system. They were also 40,000 pounds of concentrated dead weight. They're rigging the first one, Tug said. Elena watched the seismic monitor. The line was a flat, steady green. The background noise of the base, the trucks, the distant artillery range showed up as small, rhythmic blips. She felt the tension in her own body, her muscles coiled like springs. She wasn't rooting for the building to fall. She wasn't hoping for a disaster just to be right. She was mourning the building before it was even gone. She was mourning the waste of effort, the risk to the lives of the soldiers who would eventually walk those halls. At 12:14, the crane began its first lift. The line on Elena's monitor spiked as the crane's outriggers dug into the soil, transferring the weight of the generator into the earth. First one's up, Tug whispered. The crane swung slowly, a graceful, lethal arc. The generator hovered over the roof of the C2 hub, a dark shadow against the bright afternoon sky. On the monitor, Elena saw a new pattern emerge. It wasn't a spike. It was a low-frequency oscillation, a shiver. The ground is settling, she said, her voice a whisper. It's not holding. The generator was lowered onto the roof. On the camera feed, the building didn't move. To the naked eye, everything was perfect. Captain Miller was likely standing on the ground below, checking his clipboard and feeling a sense of triumph. He had proven the dirt warrant wrong. The second generator went up at 13:30, the third at 14:45. Each time, the seismic oscillation grew more pronounced. The wiring was being overloaded. The stress wasn't staying in the steel. It was being forced down into a foundation that was already at its breaking point. At 15:20, as the fourth generator was being hoisted into the air, the weather broke. A sudden, violent Georgia thunderstorm rolled in, the sky turning the color of a bruised plum. The wind picked up, gusting to 40 miles per hour. The rain came down in a white sheet, turning the red clay into a slurry. They should stop, Tug said, leaning closer to the screen. The wind's catching the load. They won't stop, Elena said. They're too close to being finished. Miller wants to be done before the colonel leaves for the day. On the monitor, the seismic line began to dance. It was no longer a shiver. It was a jagged, frantic heartbeat. Elena looked at her manual diagram, the one she'd memorized. The fourth generator was being placed on the southwest corner, the exact spot where the wiring failed. There, Elena said, pointing to the screen. The crane had just set the fourth generator down. For a moment, everything was still. The rain lashed against the building and the wind howled through the open steel frame. Then the seismic monitor didn't just spike. It went off the scale. On the camera feed, a small puff of gray dust erupted from the second floor of the building. It was the epoxy paint and a sliver of steel shearing off the C12 junction. It's starting, Elena said. She didn't wait. She grabbed her radio and her hard hat. Tug, get the truck. We're going back. The colonel's gonna have your head, Chief. He can have it after I get those workers out of there. The drive back to the site was a blur of mud and rain. Elena pushed the Humvee through the standing water, her mind racing. She wasn't thinking about Miller or the colonel. She was thinking about the four-man crew on the roof who were unhooking the crane cables. She was thinking about the two electricians on the second floor who were running conduit. When they arrived, the site was in chaos. The wind was so loud it was hard to hear anything else, but as Elena stepped out of the truck, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a deep, metallic asterisk thrum asterisk, like a giant guitar string being plucked. It was the sound of an I-beam reaching its elastic limit. She ran toward the building, her boots sinking into the red muck. She saw Captain Miller standing near the engineering trailer, shouting into a radio trying to be heard over the storm. He looked at her, his face a mask of confusion and growing fear. "Chief, I told you to stay away. Get them out, Miller," she screamed, pointing at the building. "Get the crew off the roof and out of the structure, now. The building is fine, it's just the wind." As if on cue, a second asterisk thrum asterisk echoed through the air. This time it was followed by a sharp, rhythmic asterisk bang 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 asterisk, the sound of grade 8 structural bolts snapping like glass beads. Miller froze. He looked up at the building. In the flash of a lightning bolt, he saw it. The southwest corner of the third floor wasn't level anymore. It was dipping, a subtle but undeniable sag. "Evacuate!" Miller finally screamed into his radio. "Everyone out now, now, now!" Elena didn't wait for the workers to come to her. She ran into the building. The air inside was thick with the smell of ozone and pulverized concrete. The toothache in her head had become a blinding pain. She could feel the building twisting, the entire three-story structure trying to pivot on the C-12 column. She reached the second floor and found the two electricians. They were staring at a wall that was literally groaning, the metal studs bending before their eyes. "Out! Go!" Elena grabbed the nearest man by the harness and shoved him toward the stairs. "Don't look back. Run." She stayed on the second floor, her hand pressed against the main support beam. She was listening. She needed to know how much time they had. The vibrations were becoming erratic, the wiring of the building snapping in a dozen places at once. She felt a sudden, sharp jolt. The foundation had finally given way. The southwest corner of the bunker had collapsed into the saturated soil. She turned and ran for the stairs just as the ceiling above her buckled. A section of concrete flooring from the third floor crashed down behind her, sending a cloud of dust and debris through the hallway. She didn't stop. She leaped down the last 5 steps and burst out into the rain, Tug catching her by the arm and dragging her away from the perimeter. They reached the edge of the site just as the building made its final, terminal sound. It wasn't a roar. It was a sigh. A long, drawn-out groan of steel being tortured beyond its endurance. The southwest corner of the C2 hub folded inward, the 3-story structure collapsing with a surgical precision that perfectly mirrored the red grease pencil lines on Elena's diagram. The massive generators, 40,000 pounds each, slid off the roof like toys, crushing the floors beneath them as they fell. In less than 30 seconds, the crown jewel of Fort Calloway was a heap of twisted I-beams and broken concrete. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the rain and the distant, fading wail of a siren. Elena stood in the mud, her chest heaving, her face covered in gray dust. She looked at the wreckage. It had fallen exactly as she said it would. Not a foot to the left, not a foot to the right. The C-12 junction sat at the very top of the debris pile, the mounting plate sheared clean, the steel beam twisted into a grotesque spiral. Captain Miller was a few yards away on his knees in the mud. He was staring at the pile of rubble that used to be his career. He looked at Elena, his eyes wide and vacant. He didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Colonel Hedges arrived 10 minutes later. He didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at the contractors who were huddled under the eaves of the trailer, their faces pale. He walked straight up to Elena. He looked at her muddy uniform, her steady hands, and then he looked at the wreckage. "Did everyone get out?" the colonel asked, his voice low. "Yes, sir," Elena said. "All accounted for." The colonel nodded slowly. He looked at the ruin of the building, then back at Elena. "I have your diagram on my desk, Chief. The one you left in the trailer." "Yes, sir." "I looked at it again while the crane was working. I didn't understand half of what you wrote, the stress wiring, the harmonic resonance. It looked like gibberish to me." He paused, the rain dripping off the brim of his hat. "But I'm looking at that pile of steel now, and it looks exactly like your drawing." Elena didn't feel a sense of victory. She didn't feel the urge to say asterisk, I told you so asterisk. She just felt the heavy, cold weight of the cost, the millions of dollars wasted, the months of work gone, the trust that had been broken. The building was telling us it was going to fail, Colonel, Elena said quietly. Most people just didn't want to listen to the language it was using. Hedges looked at her for a long time. Well, Chief, I think it's time we started listening to you. Pack your gear. We're going to the headquarters. There are about 50 engineers from USACE heading this way, and they're going to want to know how a chief warrant officer with a grease pencil saw what a $6 million computer missed. Elena looked at Tug, who was standing by the Humvee, a small, grim smile on his face. She felt the toothache in her head finally begin to fade, replaced by a quiet, steady hum. The building was gone, but the truth remained. Tug, she called out, grab the sensors. We're going to need the data. As she climbed into the truck, she didn't look back at the wreckage. She looked ahead at the long, difficult road of the investigation and the rebuild. She knew the cost of being right. She knew she would be the one they blamed in the reports, even as they used her diagrams to fix the mess. But as she closed the door, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. The ground beneath the wheels of the Humvee felt solid. The wiring of the world, for the moment, was back in tune. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the two halves of the red grease pencil. She looked at them for a second, then tucked them into her sleeve. She would need them. There was more of the world that needed to be mapped, and she was the only one who knew how to draw the lines that no one else could see. The rain continued to fall, washing the red Georgia clay over the broken concrete, burying the mistake even as the lessons were just beginning to be learned. Elena leaned her head against the window, her eyes already scanning the horizon, listening for the next chord, the next vibration, the next truth that was waiting to be told. The investigation would start tomorrow. The lawyers and the politicians and the generals would all have their say. They would pore over the blueprints and the software logs and the core samples. They would look for someone to fire and someone to promote. But in the end, it wouldn't matter what they found. The building had already spoken. It had fallen exactly where Elena had drawn the line. And in the quiet of the truck, as the engine rumbled to life, she knew that from now on, when she spoke, they wouldn't just hear her. They would listen. The Humvee pulled away from the site, its headlights cutting through the gloom of the storm. Behind them, the ruins of the C2 hub sat like a jagged monument to arrogance. But as they drove toward the main gate, Elena saw a group of soldiers standing under a nearby awning, watching them pass. They didn't know her name. They didn't know she had saved their lives 3 hours ago. But they saw the white hard hat on the dashboard and the steady, forward-looking gaze of the woman in the passenger seat. And for now, that was enough. The first part of the story ended not with a bang, but with the slow, rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers, clearing the way for what was coming next. The threat was no longer a shadow. It was a reality. And Elena Vance, the woman who could hear the steel scream, was finally in the lead. She reached out and touched the dashboard, feeling the vibration of the engine. It was a perfect, steady C major. For the first time in a long time, Elena Vance allowed herself to breathe. But as they passed the last security checkpoint, her radio crackled to life. It wasn't the colonel. It wasn't Miller. It was a frequency she didn't recognize, a low-frequency pulse that made the toothache in her head spike with a sudden, sharp intensity. "Chief Vance," a voice said through the static, cold and precise. "We've been watching your work at Fort Calloway. The building was just the beginning. We need you to look at a wiring diagram for something much larger." Elena gripped the radio, her knuckles white. She looked out into the darkness of the Georgia woods, the realization sinking in that the C2 hub hadn't just been a mistake. It had been a test. And she was the only one who had passed. Elena did not answer. She stared at the radio's small, glowing display, the green numbers of the frequency shimmering in the dark cab of the Humvee. The voice hadn't sounded like a soldier's. It didn't have the clipped, rhythmic cadence of a dispatcher or the stressed-out rasp of someone caught in the storm. It was a clean voice, one that sounded like it had been synthesized in a laboratory, devoid of any regional accent, perfectly calibrated to be heard over the roar of the rain and the low-frequency hum of the engine. Beside her, Tug's large hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles standing out like white stones. He had heard it, too. He didn't look at the radio. He kept his eyes on the road, the wipers throwing arcs of muddy water against the glass. He didn't ask her if she was going to respond. He knew her well enough to know she was already calculating the physics of the voice itself, the way the signal didn't bounce off the nearest repeater, the way it seemed to emerge from the air around them rather than the speaker. The static returned, a dry, whispering sound that felt like sandpaper against the back of Elena's skull. She reached out and clicked the radio off, but the toothache in her head, the sharp, pulsing pressure that usually signaled a structural failure, didn't fade. It intensified. It wasn't the building anymore. The building was a pile of rubble behind them, a dead thing. This was something else. This was the sensation of a larger system, something vast and invisible beginning to rack and groan under a weight she couldn't yet see. She looked out the side window as they passed the garrison headquarters, a low-slung brick building that usually felt like the most stable point on the base. Tonight, as the lightning flashed, the bricks looked porous. The foundation felt like it was floating on a sea of oil. Tug finally spoke when they reached the entrance of the motor pool, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through her focus. "That wasn't a standard net, Chief. I've been around radios since I was a kid in the hollers. That signal had a footprint like a dead man's hand. No echo, no carry." "It wasn't a signal, Tug," Elena said, her voice sounding far away even to herself. She was looking at her own hands. They were covered in the fine, gray dust of the collapsed C2 hub. It looked like ash. It was a direct-line transmission. They weren't broadcasting. They were talking to this specific unit. To me. Tug pulled the Humvee into a darkened bay and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the asterisk tink-tink-tink asterisk of the cooling metal and the steady drum of the rain on the corrugated tin roof of the motor pool. In the shadows, the massive shapes of bulldozers and excavators sat like sleeping beasts. This was Elena's sanctuary, the place where the world was made of steel and grease and predictable torque. But tonight, the sanctuary felt breached. "The Colonel told you to go to HQ," Tug reminded her. He didn't move to get out. He sat there, his massive frame dwarfing the seat, his eyes fixed on the dark windshield. "You go there now, they're going to put you in a room with a bunch of guys in suits who are going to try to make you the reason $400 million just turned into a pile of scrap. You know how this goes. They don't like the person who saw the crack. They like the person who can explain why the crack wasn't their fault." Elena leaned her head back against the seat. The tension in her neck was a physical cord, pulled so tight she wondered if it would snap with the same dry pop as her grease pencil. "I'm not going to HQ yet. I'm going to the shop. I need to see the seismic logs from the buried sensors, not the ones on the laptop, the raw data on the hard drive buffer. Chief Hedges is waiting." "Let him wait," she said, her voice hardening. "If I go in there now, I'm just a warrant officer who got lucky and predicted a collapse. I'm a mystic. I'm a dirt warrant with a hunch. If I go in there with the raw data, I'm the only person in the world who knows why that building didn't just fall, why it was pushed." Tug turned his head then, his eyes searching hers in the dim light of the bay. "Pushed? You saw the soil, Elena. You saw the C12 column. It was a structural failure. You called it 12 hours before it happened." "I called the vulnerability, Tug. I saw where the building was weak, but the collapse happened too fast. A structural failure of that magnitude from a saturated foundation should have been a slow-motion tilt. It should have taken minutes, maybe hours, for the secondary supports to shear, but you saw it. You felt it. The whole southwest corner dropped like the earth had been scooped out from under it. That wasn't settling. That was a triggered event." She opened the door and stepped out into the humid, oil-scented air of the motor pool. Her boots felt heavy, the red clay of the site already hardening into a crust. She walked toward the small, glass-walled office at the back of the bay, her gait steady and purposeful. Tug followed her, his boots thudding on the concrete, a silent guardian who had long ago decided that her hunches were more reliable than the Army's regulations. Inside the office, the air was stale and smelled of old coffee and ozone. Elena sat at the workstation and began to type, her fingers moving with a dark competence that had no room for hesitation. She bypassed the standard network login, using a backdoor she'd programmed herself back when she was a sergeant. She didn't want the post's IT department to know she was digging. She didn't want the ivory tower, crowd at the Corps of Engineers, to see her footprint. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of jagged, multicolored lines. This was the heartbeat of Fort Calloway, the seismic activity of 10,000 acres of Georgia forest and military industrialism. She zoomed in on the window of the collapse, focusing on the sensors she'd buried 60 feet deep, far below the reach of the wind or the rain. "Look at this," she whispered. Tug leaned over her shoulder, his breath warm in the cold office. He looked at the lines. To him, they were just scribbles. To Elena, they were a musical score. The green line is the background noise, she explained, her finger tracing a steady, low-level vibration. The blue line is the crane. You can see the spikes every time they lifted a generator. It's rhythmic, predictable, but look at the red line. That's the sensor directly under the bunker slab. She pointed to a moment exactly 4 seconds before the building collapsed. On the screen, the red line didn't spike. It did something far more terrifying. It flattened into a perfect, unnatural sine wave. A harmonic pulse, Elena said, her voice tight. Exactly 60 hertz. It stayed there for 3 seconds. That's not a geological event. That's not a structural failure. That's a resonance frequency. Someone wasn't just watching the building tug. They were feeding a vibration into the foundation. They were looking for the wiring, just like I do. They found the point where the building's natural frequency met the soil's saturation point, and they hit it with a hammer made of sound. Who the hell can do that? Tug asked. The people who were watching, she said. She leaned back, the toothache in her head now a screaming alarm. The building wasn't just a failure of engineering, it was a demolition. A controlled test to see if someone, anyone, would notice the difference between an accident and an intervention. She sat there in the silence of the office, the weight of the realization settling into her marrow. She was a chief warrant officer in the United States Army, a woman who had spent her life building things that were meant to last, things that protected the people she served with. She believed in the mission. She believed in the chain of command, even when it was populated by men like Miller who couldn't see past their own egos. But as she looked at that 60 hertz sine wave, she realized that the mission had changed. The enemy wasn't in a valley in a foreign country. The enemy was someone who could reach into the very foundation of an American military base and turn a 4-story building into a coffin with a whisper. The door to the motor pool office creaked open. Elena didn't jump. She didn't even turn around. She knew the sound of those boots. They were polished, expensive, and they moved with a deliberate, slow pace that was designed to intimidate. The colonel is wondering why his most accurate engineer is hiding in a grease pit, Chief Vance, Captain Miller said. He was standing in the doorway, his uniform miraculously dry, his face a mask of pale fury. He looked like a man who had spent the last 2 hours being shredded by his superiors and was now looking for someone to bleed on. He didn't look at the screen. He didn't look at Tug. He looked at Elena with a mixture of hatred and a strange, desperate kind of pleading. "I'm not hiding, Captain," Elena said, her voice cool. She didn't close the laptop. She didn't hide the data. She just sat there, her spine straight, her hands resting on the desk. "I'm doing the post-action analysis, the kind that didn't happen during the planning phase." Miller stepped into the small office, the space suddenly feeling cramped. He was a man of the system, a man who believed that if you followed the protocol, the world would behave. The collapse of the C2 hub had shattered his reality, and he was trying to glue the pieces back together using the only tool he had left, authority. "The planning phase is over, Chief. The building is a loss. The JAG officers are already drafting the inquiry papers. They're going to look at the logs. They're going to see that you were on the site after being ordered to stand down. They're going to see that you were interfering with the sensors right before the collapse." Elena felt the controlled rage stir in her chest, a cold, sharp blade. "Interfering? I was the only one who told you it would fall, Captain. I gave you the maps. I showed you the wiring. You chose to ignore it because the software told you what you wanted to hear." "The software was correct," Miller snapped, his voice rising. "The soil failed because of a 1-in-100-year weather event. The collapse was an act of God, Vance, but your presence there, your predictions, that looks like something else. To a prosecutor, it looks like you knew it would fall because you made sure it would fall." Tug took a step forward, his massive shoulders blocking Miller's path. "Watch your mouth, Captain. You were the one standing in the rain while the chief was dragging people out of the debris. You didn't even have your radio on." Miller looked at Tug, his eyes flickering with a moment of genuine fear before he turned his gaze back to Elena. "You think you're a hero, don't you? You think because you were right, you're untouchable. But the Army doesn't need people who are right in spite of the system. It needs people who are part of the system. You're a liability, Vance. You always have been. You see things, you hear things, you talk about buildings like they're alive. You know what they call that in the medical corps? They call it a stress-induced hallucination. They call it a break from reality." Elena stood up then. She moved slowly, her eyes locked onto Miller's. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't show him the anger. She just stood there, a woman who had spent her life in the mud and the steel, and she let him see the absolute certainty in her soul. "You can call it whatever you want, Captain. You can take my bars. You can put me in a room with a psychiatrist. You can tell the colonel that I sabotaged a building I've been trying to save for 6 months. But it won't change the fact that the building fell exactly where I said it would. And it won't change the fact that right now, as we're standing here, there's a harmonic pulse in the seismic data that didn't come from the wind or the rain. Miller laughed, a short, brittle sound. A pulse? You're chasing ghosts, Chief. The building is down, the story is over. The story is just beginning, Elena said. She reached out and grabbed her hard hat. And if you want to be the one who tells the colonel that he's building his new command center on a lie, then you go right ahead. But I'm going to the headquarters, and I'm bringing the truth with me. She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his, a deliberate act of defiance that cost her more than she would ever admit. She felt the weight of the institution pressing down on her, the quiet, grinding failure of a system that would rather destroy a person than acknowledge a mistake. As she stepped out into the motor pool, she felt Tug at her side, his presence a solid, grounding force. "You really going to the lion's den?" Tug asked as they reached the truck. "I have to, Tug. If I don't, they'll bury the data. They'll bury the 60 hertz pulse. And whoever did this will just move on to the next target." "What's the next target?" Elena looked toward the eastern horizon, where the lights of the base's main power substation glowed in the distance. The toothache in her head flared, a rhythmic, pulsing pain that matched the sine wave on her screen. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think we're about to find out." The drive to the garrison headquarters was a study in institutional tension. Military police vehicles were everywhere, their blue and red lights reflecting off the standing water on the asphalt. The base was in a state of controlled panic, the kind of high-stakes environment where everyone is looking for someone to blame so they can stop being afraid. When Elena entered the headquarters, the air changed. It was no longer the smell of mud and rain. It was the smell of floor wax, industrial air conditioning, and the specific, metallic scent of high-level anxiety. The hallways were filled with officers in pristine ocs, their voices hushed, their eyes avoiding hers as she walked past. She was a ghost walking through a cathedral. She was the woman who had seen the end of the world and had the audacity to survive it. She was ushered into a small, windowless conference room. It wasn't the main briefing room. It was a holding area, a place where they put people before they broke them. There was a single table, 4 chairs, and a pitcher of water that no one had touched. Colonel Hedges was already there, but he wasn't alone. Sitting beside him was a man Elena didn't recognize. He was civilian, wearing a charcoal gray suit that cost more than a year of Elena's salary. He had a face like a hawk, sharp, observant, and completely devoid of warmth. He didn't have a name tag, but he had a folder on the table in front of him with a seal she didn't recognize. "Chief Vance," Hedges said, his voice tired. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last 5 hours. "Sit down." Elena sat. She didn't take off her hard hat. She didn't wipe the dust from her face. She just sat there, her hands folded on the table, her eyes on the colonel. "This is Mr. Thorne," Hedges said, gesturing to the man in the suit. "He's with the Defense Oversight Committee. He's been assigned to the preliminary investigation into the TOC collapse." Thorne didn't offer his hand. He just looked at Elena, his eyes scanning her as if he were reading a blueprint. "Chief Vance, I've been reading your file. You have a very unconventional record. A dirt warrant with a reputation for feeling structural issues. That's a very useful trait in the field. In a laboratory, we'd call it an anomaly." "I call it physics, sir," Elena said, her voice level. "Physics is measurable, Chief. Your feelings are not. And yet you predicted the collapse of a hardened facility with a precision that defies the modeling of 3 separate engineering firms. That's not just an anomaly. That's a statistical impossibility." Elena felt the trap closing around her. It wasn't about the building anymore. It was about her. They were going to turn her capability into a weapon they could use against her. If she was too accurate, she must be involved. If she saw things others didn't, she must be delusional. "The building was built on a saturated foundation, Mr. Thorne. I mapped the stress paths manually. I showed the colonel the grease pencil diagrams. The physics were all there. Most people just chose to look at the software instead of the ground." Thorne leaned forward, his hands interlaced on the table. "I'm not interested in the software, Chief, and I'm not interested in the ground. I'm interested in the signal, the one you were looking at in the motor pool 10 minutes ago." The room went cold. Elena felt the toothache in her head spike into a sharp, white-hot needle of pain. She looked at Hedges, but the colonel wouldn't meet her eyes. He was looking at the table, his face a mask of weary resignation. "We know about the seismic sensors, Vance," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. We know about the backdoor you built into the garrison network, and we know you've been looking for a 60 hertz pulse. If you know about the pulse, then you know the collapse wasn't an accident, Elena said, her voice tight. The collapse was exactly what we needed it to be, Thorne replied. He opened his folder and slid a photograph across the table. Elena looked at it. It wasn't a photo of the building. It was a photo of her. It was taken 3 years ago in a dusty valley in the Kunar province of Afghanistan. She was standing on a bridge, a small, rickety thing she'd built out of salvaged steel and local timber. She was looking at the ground, her hand pressed against the main pylon. "You have a gift, Chief Vance," Thorne said. "A hypersensitivity to the language of physical systems. You can see the wiring of the world. Most people are blind to it. They see a wall, you see the tension. They see a bridge, you see the gravity. We've been looking for someone like you for a very long time." "Who is we?" Elena asked. "The people who understand that the next war won't be fought with bombs or bullets. It will be fought with resonance. It will be fought by finding the wiring of an entire nation, the power grids, the dams, the transport hubs, and turning them against themselves." The C2 hub at Fort Calloway was a test bed for a new type of structural interdiction. We needed to see if the current generation of military engineers could detect the intervention. Elena felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She looked at the colonel. You knew the building was being sabotaged." "I didn't know it would be destroyed, Elena," Hedges said, his voice cracking. "I was told it was a stress test, a way to verify the hardened specifications. I didn't think they'd actually drop the floor. You risked the lives of my workers for a test." Elena's voice was a low, dangerous growl. She stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "You let those men go on the roof, you let those electricians stay inside." "They were never in any danger," Thorne said, his voice dismissive. "We had our own sensors. We knew exactly when the shear point would be reached. We had the evacuation timed to the second." "You didn't have the evacuation timed," Elena spat. "I did. I was the one who dragged them out. If I hadn't been there, those men would be dead. Your timed evacuation would have been a mass funeral." Thorne didn't blink. He just watched her, his expression one of clinical interest. "And that, Chief Vance, is why you passed the test. Not because you saw the collapse coming, but because you acted in spite of the system. You prioritized the mission, the lives of your soldiers over the regulations. You are the only person on this base who can hear the steel scream and has the courage to do something about it." He stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. "The investigation into the TOC collapse will be closed tomorrow. It will be officially listed as a foundational failure due to extreme weather conditions. Captain Miller will be reassigned to a desk in Virginia. Colonel Hedges will retire with his full pension, and you, Chief, are coming with me." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Elena said. "You don't understand," Thorne said, stepping around the table. "This wasn't an invitation. You are a unique asset, Chief Vance. You have a capability that is both a strategic advantage and a national security risk. You can't stay here. You can't go back to building runways and bridges. You've seen the wiring now. You can't unsee it." Elena looked at the colonel, but Hedges was a broken man, a figurehead who had traded his soul for a quiet retirement. She realized then that the institution hadn't just failed her. It had been hollowed out from the inside. The army she loved, the system she had dedicated her life to, was being used as a playground for men like Thorne, men who saw soldiers as variables and buildings as disposable tools. She felt the controlled rage settle into something colder, something more permanent. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a dirt warrant being sidelined. She was the only person in the room who knew the truth, and she was the only one with the skill to stop what was coming next. "What's the next target?" she asked, her voice like ice. Thorne smiled for the first time. It was a thin, predatory expression. "We're not targeting anything, Chief. We're going to prevent a catastrophe. There is a bridge in South Carolina, the Cooper River Bridge. It carries 60,000 cars a day. It's the primary artery for the Charleston Naval Base. 3 days ago, a 60 hertz pulse was detected in the main suspension cable. Someone else has found the wiring, Chief. Someone who doesn't work for us." Elena felt the toothache in her head explode into a blinding light. She didn't believe him. She didn't believe a word that came out of his mouth. But she knew the Cooper River Bridge. She had studied its blueprints in Warrant Officer Candidate School. It was a marvel of modern engineering, a beautiful, delicate balance of tension and compression. If someone hit it with a harmonic pulse, it wouldn't just collapse. It would disintegrate. "You're lying," she said. "You're using this to get me to follow you." "Maybe," Thorne said. "But do you want to be the one who waits to find out, or do you want to be the one who stops it?" He walked to the door and opened it. Standing in the hallway were two men in tactical gear, their faces hidden behind dark visors. They weren't military police. They were something else, private contractors. The Red Cell. Elena looked at the empty conference room, at the broken colonel, and at the photo of herself in Afghanistan. She realized that the world she knew was gone. She was no longer building for the army. She was fighting for the world itself, one structural junction at a time. She walked out of the room, her boots echoing in the hollow hallway. She didn't look back. She didn't say goodbye. She just followed the man in the suit toward the black subs waiting in the rain. But as she reached the exit, she saw a familiar figure standing by the security desk. It was Tug. He was holding her gear bag, his face a mask of grim determination. He didn't ask her where she was going. He didn't ask her if she was okay. He just stepped into line behind her. "Where she goes, I go," Tug said to the guard, his voice a low rumble that made the glass in the lobby vibrate. The guard looked at the men in tactical gear. They nodded. Elena felt a small, flickering spark of hope in the darkness. She wasn't alone. She had her partner. She had her talent, and she had the truth. As they climbed into the SUV, the mysterious frequency crackled over the vehicle's high-end comms system. It was the same voice, cold and precise. "Welcome to the team, Chief Vance. We're approaching the bridge. The wiring is already beginning to sing. I hope you're ready to listen." Elena leaned her head against the seat, her eyes closing as she focused on the vibration of the tires on the road. The toothache was there, but she wasn't fighting it anymore. She was using it. She was mapping the wiring of the SUV, the road, the city, the entire state. She was becoming the sensor. The SUV pulled out of the garrison headquarters, the lights of Fort Calloway fading into the storm behind them. They were heading south, toward the coast, toward a bridge that was already beginning to scream in a language only she could understand. And as the needle on the speedometer climbed to 90, Elena Vance made a decision. She wasn't going to be their asset. She wasn't going to be their test subject. She was going to find whoever was sending that pulse, and she was going to show them exactly what happens when you try to break something she's sworn to protect. The dirt warrant was going to war. The drive was a silent blur of wet pavement and flickering streetlights. Thorne sat in the front seat, his eyes fixed on a tablet that showed a real-time feed of the Cooper River Bridge. Elena sat in the back with Tug, the two of them a silent island of resistance in the middle of a moving conspiracy. "Chief," Tug whispered, leaning close so only she could hear. "I grabbed the raw data from the shop, the seismic logs. I have them on a thumb drive in my boot." Elena didn't look at him. She didn't even nod. But she felt the tension in her chest ease just a fraction. She had the evidence. She had the wiring diagram of the sabotage. 3 hours to Charleston," Thorne said, not looking back. "The pulse is increasing in frequency. We have a window of 6 hours before the first cable begins to fray. You're going to be on a high-speed hoist, Chief. You're going to go to the top of the pylon and tell us exactly where the resonance is being induced." "And then what?" Elena asked. Thorne turned around then, his eyes dark and cold in the shadows of the car. "And then, Chief, you're going to help us turn it off, by any means necessary." The SUV surged forward, the engines hum a steady, rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of Elena's heart. The storm was getting worse, the wind howling through the trees, the world outside becoming a chaotic, shifting landscape of shadow and light. But inside the car, the wiring was clear. Elena could feel the tension in the frame, the friction of the tires, the heat of the electronics. She was ready. She looked out the window at the dark Georgia woods, her mind already on the bridge, already listening for the first note of the catastrophe. She knew it was coming. She could feel it in her teeth. The toothache was no longer a warning. It was a countdown, and the clock had just hit 0. The SUV hit a sudden, violent bump as they transitioned onto the interstate. And for a split second, the wiring of the car shuddered. Elena felt it, a momentary lapse in the suspension, a microscopic crack in the rear axle that Thorne's team hadn't noticed. She didn't tell them. She just sat there, her hands folded, her eyes on the road. She would let them find out for themselves. Because from now on, the only person Elena Vance was going to save was the one who could hear the truth. The rest of the world was on its own. As the city lights of Savannah flickered in the distance, the radio in the SUV hissed once more. "Chief Vance, we've reached the bridge. The first cable has just snapped. You have 5 hours. Don't be late." The voice faded into static, but the toothache in Elena's head didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, a screaming, rhythmic roar that drowned out the sound of the rain. She looked at Tug. He looked at her. The mission had begun, and the cost of being right was about to become higher than anyone had ever imagined. The black Suburban hit the transition plate of the Ravenel Bridge at 90 miles per hour, and the world inside the cabin turned into a drum. Elena felt the impact not in her seat, but in the base of her skull, a sharp, metallic ring that vibrated through her molars. Outside the tinted windows, the Cooper River was a churning expanse of black glass, whipped into a frenzy by the gale-force winds screaming off the Atlantic. The bridge itself, a shimmering harp of steel and concrete, loomed ahead like a ghost in the rain. Its twin diamond towers reached 500 feet into the low, bruised clouds, but as the SUV sped onto the main span, Elena didn't see the architecture. She saw the load paths. She saw the 1,800 feet of cable-stayed suspension as a series of tension vectors, a delicate balance of gravity and pull that was currently being shredded by an invisible hand. The toothache was no longer a dull throb. It was a rhythmic 60 hertz hammer striking the bridge's foundation. Thorne sat in the front, his silhouette motionless against the strobe light flashes of the emergency beacons reflecting off the wet pavement. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at a ruggedized tablet, his face bathed in the sickly blue light of a seismic waveform. Elena watched the back of his head, her hands resting flat on her thighs. She was counting, not seconds, but the intervals between the bridge's natural oscillations. A cable-stayed bridge is designed to breathe, to sway, to absorb the energy of the wind and the traffic. But this breath was ragged. It was the gasping of a lung filled with fluid. Every time the SUV crossed a joint, the vibration lasted a millisecond too long. The steel wasn't recovering. The wiring of the bridge was being saturated with energy it wasn't designed to hold. "We're 2 minutes out from the south pylon," Thorne said, his voice flat, devoid of the adrenaline that should have been coursing through a man heading into a structural catastrophe. The South Carolina Highway Patrol has the span cleared, but they couldn't get the last of the civilian vehicles off the North Charleston side before the first cable let go. "There's a stalled sedan 300 yards past the pylon. Ignore it. Your target is the anchor box inside the tower." Elena didn't look at him. She looked at Tug. The big man was staring out the window, his jaw set so tight the muscles in his neck looked like braided cable. He reached down and touched the heavy canvas bag at his feet. The go bag they'd packed in the motor pool, filled with sensors, grease pencils, and a hydraulic torque wrench that had no business being in a civilian contractor vehicle. He was her anchor. He was the only thing in this moving cage of steel that felt real. "I'm not ignoring anything, Thorne," Elena said. Her voice was a low, steady vibration that matched the hum of the tires. "If that bridge oscillates another 3 inches to the west, that sedan is going over the rail. You want me to stop the pulse. Then you get me to the pylon and stay the hell out of my way." "You have your orders, Chief," Thorne replied, and for the first time there was a sliver of ice in his tone. "The mission is the integrity of the asset. Everything else is secondary." "In my army, the people are the asset," she said. The SUV screeched to a halt at the base of the south pylon. The door was open before the vehicle had finished rocking on its suspension. Elena stepped out into a wall of wind and water that nearly took her breath away. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched metallic shriek that sounded like 1,000 knives being sharpened at once. It was the wind through the stay cables, but underneath it there was a deeper, more terrifying sound. A low-frequency groan that came from the very heart of the concrete. It was the sound of the earth trying to reject the bridge. She looked up. The stay cables, thick as a man's torso and encased in high-density plastic, were vibrating with such intensity they appeared blurred against the dark sky. To anyone else, it looked like weather. To Elena, it looked like a heart attack. She could see the standing wave moving up the longest cable, a physical ripple of energy that was looking for a place to ground. "Tug, the seismic kit, now!" she shouted over the roar. Tug was already there, his massive frame shielding her from the worst of the spray. He handed her the laser vibrometer, a device that looked like a futuristic surveying tool. Elena didn't wait. She dropped to one knee on the vibrating asphalt, the rain soaking through her ops in seconds, and aimed the laser at the base of the tower. The readout flickered, then stabilized. 62 hertz, she muttered, the words disappearing into the wind. "They've shifted the frequency. They're chasing the bridge's natural resonance." "Chief, look!" Tug pointed upward. 300 feet above them, one of the mid-span cables, a massive white line of steel, suddenly whipped like a snapped guitar string. The sound was a thunderclap that shook the very air in Elena's lungs. The outer casing of the cable shattered, raining shards of white plastic down onto the empty roadway. The steel strands inside, now exposed to the elements, began to fray with a terrifying, rhythmic asterisk snap 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 asterisk. Elena stood up, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't afraid. She didn't have room for fear. Her mind was a tactical map of the structure, and the map was turning red. "The pulse isn't coming from the ground, Tug," she said, her voice tightening with a dark, focused competence. "Thorne said the anchor box. He's lying. If it was the anchor box, the vibration would be bottom-heavy, but look at the cable movement. The node is higher up. It's in the dampers." She turned to the SUV. Thorne was standing by the open door, watching her with that same clinical, predatory interest. He didn't move to help. He didn't even look at the fraying cable. He was waiting to see what she would do. "You knew," Elena said, stepping toward him, her boots splashing in the oily water. "You knew the source was in the dampers. You wanted to see if I could find it." "The dampers are 400 feet up, Chief," Thorne said, ignoring her accusation. "There's a maintenance hoist inside the tower. It's narrow, it's dark, and the tower is currently swaying 4 degrees off-center. If you're as good as your file says, you'll be at the top in 5 minutes. If you're not, the bridge belongs to the river." Elena didn't waste another second on him. She grabbed her bag from Tug, slung it over her shoulder, and headed for the heavy steel door at the base of the pylon. Tug was right on her heels, his heavy boots echoing her own. Inside the tower, the world changed. The roar of the wind was replaced by a suffocating, metallic resonance. The interior of the pylon was a hollow concrete shell, filled with a maze of steel ladders, conduits, and the massive anchor plates where the stay cables were secured to the tower's core. The air smelled of damp concrete, old grease, and ozone. "Stay here, Tug," Elena said, her hand on the cold steel of the first ladder. "Monitor the base sensors. If the frequency hits 65, you get out. You don't wait for me. You get off the span." Tug looked at her, his face obscured by the shadows, but she could see the flash of his eyes. "You know that ain't happening, Chief. I'm the one who holds the ladder. Tug, that's an order. I'm a civilian contractor now, remember?" he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You can't NJP me for being stubborn. Now get up there and find the wiring before this whole thing turns into a pile of junk." Elena didn't argue. She turned and began to climb. The ascent was a nightmare of physics. As she climbed higher into the tapering tower, the sway became a violent, sickening lurch. The concrete groaned around her, a sound like a giant grinding its teeth. Every 30 feet, there was a small platform where the stay anchors were bolted into the wall. These were massive steel boxes under millions of pounds of tension, and as the bridge vibrated, they hummed with a low, bone-shaking frequency that made Elena's vision blur. She focused on the ladder, hand over hand, boot after boot. Her lungs burned with the stale, humid air, and the go bag felt like it was filled with lead. She could feel the pulse now, not as a sound, but as a physical presence. It was a rhythmic throb that seemed to be coming from the very air inside the tower. Asterisk thump, thump, thump. Asterisk at 350 feet, she reached the damper access level. This was where the massive hydraulic cylinders were located, the devices meant to absorb the vibration of the cables. She crawled out onto a narrow steel catwalk, the floor beneath her feet bucking like a live thing. The tower was narrower here, and the wind was screaming through the ventilation slats, a high-pitched whistle that pierced her ears. She pulled out her thermal imager. The world turned into a ghost map of blues and greens, but as she panned it across the hydraulic dampers, one of them glowed a brilliant, angry violet. "There you are," she whispered. One of the dampers, the one connected to the longest, most vulnerable cable, wasn't absorbing energy. It was generating it. A small black box, no larger than a pelican case, had been magnetically fused to the damper's main cylinder. It was hardwired into the bridge's internal power grid, drawing juice from the aviation warning lights and feeding it back into the steel as a modulated harmonic pulse. It was elegant. It was precise. It was a masterpiece of structural sabotage. Elena crawled toward the damper, her fingers gripping the edge of the catwalk as the tower lurched to the west. The bridge was screaming now, a physical sensation of agony that she felt in her own marrow. She reached the damper and reached for her bag, but as she did, a sudden, violent jolt threw her against the concrete wall. The go bag slipped. She watched, her heart stopping, as the bag slid toward the edge of the catwalk. She lunged for it, her hand catching the strap just as it began to fall into the 300-foot abyss of the tower's hollow core. She pulled it back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her knuckles white as she gripped the steel. She didn't stop to think. She couldn't afford to. She pulled out a pair of insulated cutters and reached for the wires connecting the black box to the damper. But before she could clip them, the radio in her ear crackled to life. "Chief Vance, do not disable the device," Thorne's voice said, sounding as clear as if he were standing right behind her. "We've reached the data threshold. We need to see the failure point. We need another 5 minutes of resonance." Elena froze, her hand inches from the wires. 5 minutes? The cable is already fraying, Thorne. Another 5 minutes and the pylon loses its lateral stability. The whole span will unzip. "The bridge is insured, Chief. The data is priceless. Do not touch the wires." Elena felt a cold, sharp rage bloom in her chest. It wasn't the heat of anger. It was the sub-zero clarity of a soldier who has just realized she's being used as a pawn in a game she never agreed to play. Thorne didn't want to save the bridge. He wanted to watch it die so he could measure the funeral. "I'm a warrant officer in the United States Army, Thorne," she said, her voice dropping into a register that would have made a general sit up straight. "And I don't take orders from people who treat my country like a laboratory. My mission isn't your data. My mission is the bridge and the people on it. If you clip those wires, Chief, you're interfering with a classified national security operation. You'll be in a federal brig before the sun comes up." "Then make sure they have a good library," Elena said. She clipped the first wire. The reaction was instantaneous. The black box didn't just shut down. It discharged a massive, high-frequency burst of energy that knocked Elena backward. A brilliant arc of blue electricity jumped from the damper to the catwalk, the smell of ozone suddenly overpowering the scent of concrete. Elena felt her entire body go numb, her muscles seizing as the current surged through her. She hit the floor hard, her head bouncing off the steel, the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of gray and red. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her heart was fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird, and for a terrifying second she thought she was dying. The tower swayed, a slow, sickening tilt that felt like it would never end, and Elena realized she was sliding toward the edge of the catwalk. She had no strength in her arms. Her hands were useless, tingling with the aftershocks of the discharge. She watched the edge of the platform approach, a drop into darkness that promised nothing but a fast end. Asterisk not like this, asterisk, she thought. Asterisk not for a man like Thorne. Asterisk, she forced her eyes to focus. She saw the damper, the black box still humming with a faint residual light. She saw her grease pencil lying on the floor a few inches away. She saw the wiring of the moment, the friction of her boots, the angle of the tilt, the gravity that was trying to pull her over the edge. She jammed her boot into a gap in the catwalk grating, the metal biting into her leather, anchoring her against the slide. She gasped for air, the cold wind from the ventilation slats reviving her just enough to push through the numbness. She wasn't going to let it fall. She dragged herself back toward the damper, her fingers clawing at the steel floor. Every inch was a battle against the bridge's agony. She reached the bag, fumbled for her manual torque wrench, and jammed it into the magnetic mount of the device. She didn't have the strength to pull it off, so she used her weight, throwing her entire body against the wrench, using the bridge's own oscillation to help her. The tower lurched. The bridge groaned, and with a sound like a gunshot, the magnetic seal broke. The device tumbled off the damper and fell into the dark core of the tower. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the vibration changed. The 60 hertz hammer stopped. The rhythmic throb that had been tearing the bridge apart died away, replaced by the natural, chaotic roar of the storm. The stay cables stopped their violent whipping, settling into a heavy, wind-driven sway. The bridge was still injured, still fraying, but the heart attack was over. Elena collapsed against the damper, her forehead resting on the cold, oily metal. She was shaking, her body racked with the aftereffects of the electrical surge, but she was alive, and the bridge was still standing. "Chief, Chief, do you copy?" Tug's voice was a frantic shout in her ear. She keyed her radio, her hand trembling. I'm here, Tug. The device is down. The pulse is gone." "Thank God. Thorne's people are moving, Elena. They're packing up. They're not waiting for you. They're heading for the North Charleston side. They're abandoning the site." Elena didn't act surprised. She'd known Thorne would run the moment the experiment was over. He didn't care about the bridge, and he certainly didn't care about the dirt warrant he'd left at the top of a 500-foot tower. "Let them go," she whispered. "I'm coming down." But as she moved to stand, the toothache flared one last time, not as a pulse but as a sharp, localized warning. She looked out through the ventilation slats toward the roadway below. The stalled sedan. The bridge had stopped vibrating, but the damage to the main span was severe. The North Charleston side of the bridge, the section that had taken the brunt of the resonance, was sagging. The expansion joints were pulled to their limits, and the concrete was riddled with micro-fissures. And the sedan, a small silver Honda, was sitting directly over the most compromised section of the deck. Elena saw the door of the sedan open. A woman stepped out, her movements panicked, her arms wrapped around a small child. She was looking at the swaying cables, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She didn't know the pulse had stopped. She only knew the world was falling apart around her. As Elena watched, a massive piece of the shattered cable casing, a 300-pound chunk of white plastic, slid off the main cable and plummeted toward the roadway. It hit the deck 20 feet from the sedan with the force of a bomb, the impact sending a shudder through the compromised concrete. The woman screamed. She clutched the child tighter and began to run toward the north pylon, but she was running toward the most unstable part of the span. "Tug, there's a civilian on the north span, a woman and a kid." Elena shouted into the radio. "ICM, Chief, I'm heading out." "No, stay back, the deck is unstable, Tug. If you take the truck out there, the weight will trigger a localized shear." "I ain't taking the truck, Elena. I'm going on foot." Elena scrambled toward the ladder. She forgot the pain in her limbs. She forgot the electrical burns on her hands. She moved with a desperate, frantic speed, sliding down the ladders, her boots ringing on the steel, her mind calculating the load-bearing capacity of a shattered concrete slab. She reached the base of the pylon in record time, her chest heaving, her vision narrowing to the woman and the child on the bridge. She burst through the steel door and back out into the rain. The scene was a nightmare. The wind had intensified, the gale force gusts pushing the woman toward the edge of the bridge. The roadway was littered with debris, and the bridge's emergency lights were flickering, casting long, dancing shadows across the cracked pavement. Tug was 50 yards ahead of her, his massive frame hunched against the wind as he sprinted toward the woman. He was fast for a big man, but the bridge was faster. Another cable groaned, a deep, metallic sound that signaled a total failure of the secondary supports. The deck beneath the woman's feet groaned and dropped 6 inches, the sound of shearing bolts echoing across the river. The woman fell. The child tumbled from her arms, sliding toward the widening gap in the expansion joint. "No!" Elena screamed. She didn't think about the physics. She didn't think about the load paths. She just ran. She reached the woman just as Tug reached the child. The big man dove, his hand catching the boy's jacket just as he was about to slip into the void. He pulled the child back, his face a mask of concentration, his boots skidding on the wet concrete. Elena grabbed the woman's arm, hauling her to her feet with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The woman was hysterical, her eyes wide, her voice lost in the wind. My baby, Tug has him, look at me, look at me." Elena shouted, her hands gripping the woman's shoulders. "We have to move, now." The bridge gave another sickening lurch. The gap in the expansion joint was now a foot wide, and through it, Elena could see the black, churning water of the Cooper River 300 feet below. The bridge wasn't falling, not yet, but the section they were standing on was no longer fully connected to the main pylon. It was being held up by hope and a few remaining strands of steel. "Tug, get them to the pylon, go!" Tug didn't hesitate. He tucked the boy under one arm and grabbed the woman's hand with the other, half carrying, half dragging them toward the solid concrete of the south tower. Elena stayed behind for a second, her hand pressed against the cold, wet pavement. She felt the vibration. She felt the wiring of the broken span. It was failing. The shear point was seconds away. "Elena, come on!" Tug roared, looking back over his shoulder. She started to run, but as she did, her foot caught on a piece of shattered debris. She went down hard, her knees slamming into the concrete, a flash of white-hot pain shooting up her leg. She tried to stand, but her leg buckled. The electrical surge and the fall had finally taken their toll. She looked up. Tug was 20 yards away, the woman and child safe near the pylon door. He was turning back for her, his face a mask of desperation. "Don't!" she shouted. "Stay there!" The bridge groaned again. This was the big one. The mainstay cable, the one that had been fraying, finally snapped. The sound was like a cannon shot, a violent, world-ending crack that shook the entire city of Charleston. The deck beneath Elena dropped. She felt the sensation of weightlessness, the stomach-flipping terror of a fall. But it wasn't a total collapse. The section of the deck didn't fall into the river. It tilted, one side dipping 10 feet lower than the other as the remaining cables strained to hold the load. Elena slid. Her fingers clawed at the wet asphalt, looking for a handhold, but there was nothing but smooth, rain-slicked concrete. She slid toward the low side, toward the railing, toward the black abyss. Her hand hit the base of a light pole. She gripped it, her muscles screaming, her body dangling over the edge of the tilted deck. The light pole groaned. It wasn't designed to take the lateral load of a falling woman in a 90-mile-per-hour wind. Elena! Tug was there. He had tied a heavy-duty tow strap from the go bag to the railing of the pylon and was sliding down the tilted deck toward her, his boots sparking against the concrete as he fought for traction. "Stay back, Tug. The pole is loose." "Shut up, Chief." He reached her just as the light pole-mounting bolts began to shear. He grabbed her hand, his grip like a vice, his eyes locked onto hers. For a heartbeat, the two of them were frozen, a man and a woman suspended between the sky and the sea, held together by nothing but a shared history and a stubborn refusal to give up. Tug hauled her up, his muscles bulging, his breath coming in ragged, desperate grunts. He pulled her onto the tilted deck, shielding her with his body as the bridge continued to groan and settle. "I got you," he whispered. "I got you, Elena." They crawled, inch by inch, foot by foot. They moved up the tilted slope of the roadway, their fingers bleeding, their clothes shredded by the debris. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before they reached the solid, unyielding concrete of the south pylon. Tug pushed her through the door and followed her in, slamming the heavy steel bolt home. Silence. The pylon was still humming, still swaying, but the immediate threat of the fall was gone. The three of them, Elena, Tug, and the woman with the child, sat on the floor in the darkness, the only sound the ragged breathing of 4 people who had just cheated death. The woman was sobbing quietly, clutching her son to her chest. The boy was silent, his eyes wide, staring at Elena as if she were a ghost. Elena leaned her head back against the concrete wall. She was broken. Her hands were burned, her knee was shattered, and her career was effectively over. She had defied a federal operative, destroyed a $1 million piece of classified technology, and interfered with a national security experiment. But as she looked at the boy, at the way he was breathing, at the way his heart was beating, she knew she'd made the right call. "You okay, Chief?" Tug asked, his voice a low, raspy rumble. "I'm fine, Tug," she said, her voice sounding far away. I'm tired." "You did it, Elena. The bridge is still there. The pulse is gone." "Thorne won't be," she said. "He'll be waiting at the end of the span. He'll have a team. He'll have a story." "Let him," Tug said, reaching into his boot and pulling out the thumb drive. "We have the data, the real data, the seismic logs from Fort Calloway and the frequency shift from the bridge. He can tell whatever story he wants. We have the truth." Elena looked at the thumb drive, then at Tug. She reached out and touched his hand, a small, quiet gesture that meant more than any words they could have spoken. The toothache in her head was gone. For the first time in months, the world was quiet. There were no pulses, no harmonic resonances, no screaming steel. There was just the sound of the rain against the tower and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the man beside her. They sat there for a long time, waiting for the storm to break. When the sun finally began to rise, casting a pale, gray light over the Cooper River, the bridge looked like a war zone. The main span was twisted, the cables were frayed, and the roadway was littered with the remains of the experiment. But it was standing. The emergency crews arrived an hour later, a fleet of flashing lights and sirens that seemed small and insignificant against the scale of the destruction. Elena and Tug walked out of the pylon together. They didn't wait for the helicopters. They didn't wait for the news crews. They walked toward the North Charleston side, their boots echoing on the cracked pavement. Thorne was there, just as Elena had predicted. He was standing by a black SUV, surrounded by men in tactical gear. He looked clean. He looked composed. He looked like a man who was already drafting the report that would bury Elena Vance forever. He watched them approach, his eyes tracking the way Elena limped, the way Tug carried the gear bag, the way they moved as a single, unbreakable unit. "Chief Vance," Thorne said as they reached the SUV. "You've caused a great deal of trouble." Elena didn't stop. She didn't even look at him. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the first hint of blue was beginning to break through the clouds. "The bridge is still standing, Thorne," she said, her voice cool and level. "That's all the trouble I care about. You think this is over? You think you can just walk away from what you've seen?" Elena stopped then. She turned and looked at him, and for the first time, Thorne saw the absolute, unwavering certainty in her soul. It wasn't the look of a victim. It wasn't even the look of a soldier. It was the look of a woman who had seen the wiring of the world and knew exactly how to break it. "I'm not walking away, Thorne," she said. "I'm going home. And then I'm going to find every single person who thought they could turn my country into a test bed. And I'm going to show them what happens when the dirt warrant finds the flaw in their foundation." She turned and kept walking, Tug at her side. Thorne watched them go, his face a mask of cold, calculating fury. He didn't move to stop them. He knew better. He knew that for the first time in his life, he was the one who was standing on a compromised structure. As they reached the end of the span, Elena felt the first rays of the sun hit her face. It was cold, but it was real. She looked at the bridge one last time. It was a mess. It would take months to repair, and it would never be the same again. But the wiring was intact. The load paths were clear. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of salt and morning. "What now, Chief?" Tug asked. Elena looked at the thumb drive in her hand, then at the road ahead. "Now," she said, "we go to work." The reckoning hadn't arrived yet. The institutional weight of the army, the shadow games of men like Thorne, the legal battles, the court-martials, all of that was waiting for her in the days to come. She knew the cost would be high. She knew she might lose everything she'd spent her life building. But as she stepped off the bridge and onto solid ground, she knew she wasn't alone. She had the truth. She had her partner. And she had the knowledge that somewhere deep in the wiring of the world there was a heartbeat that no pulse could ever drown out. She was Elena Vance. She was a chief warrant officer in the United States Army, and she was still standing. The fluorescent light in room 412 of the Ralph H. Johnson VA Medical Center hummed at exactly 60 hertz, the same frequency that had nearly torn the Ravenel Bridge apart 48 hours earlier. Elena Vance stared at the plastic drip chamber of her Roman 4, her left knee packed in ice, and her hands wrapped in heavy white gauze that smelled faintly of silver sulfadiazine. The toothache in her head had been replaced by a localized, thrumming ache in her marrow, a physical residue of the electrical surge that had charred the nerves in her palms. Outside the window, Charleston was a blurred watercolor of gray sky and rain-slicked palmettos, but inside the room the air was static and dry. She was waiting for the man in the charcoal suit to tell her she was no longer a soldier, and she was doing it with the same stillness she used when measuring the tension of a suspension cable. The door didn't creak. It clicked with a precise, heavy finality. It wasn't Thorne. It was Colonel Marcus Halloway from the 1st Command Special Operations, a man who had spent 30 years learning how to look at a subordinate and see a ledger. He didn't sit in the guest chair. He stood at the foot of the bed, his hands clasped behind his back, his uniform crisp and devoid of any wrinkles despite the humidity thick enough to drown a man. He looked at Elena's bandaged hands, then at her face. He didn't offer a greeting. In the high-stakes bureaucracy of the Army, greetings were for people who still had a future. The structural engineers finished their preliminary assessment of the Ravenel at 0400 today, Halloway said, his voice a low, sandpaper rasp. The South Carolina Department of Transportation is calling it a miracle of luck and weather. They say the resonance was a freak atmospheric occurrence, a localized microburst that hit the bridge's natural frequency. That's the story the public is getting. It's the story the governor is telling on the news. It's a clean story, Chief Vance. It doesn't involve classified seismic oscillators or unauthorized dirt warrants acting outside their chain of command. Elena shifted her weight, and a sharp spike of pain from her knee radiated up her spine. She didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on Halloway's. And the story the Army is getting, Colonel, is that one clean, too. The Army is currently conducting a 15-6 investigation into the events of the last 72 hours. Halloway replied, ignoring her question. They are looking at a Chief Warrant Officer 3 who abandoned her post at Fort Calloway, commandeered a civilian contractor vehicle, and interfered with a sanctioned Department of Defense field test. They are looking at the destruction of a proprietary sensor array valued at $4 million. And they are looking at a woman who claims she was saving a bridge that was never in any danger of collapse according to the primary data stream. Elena felt a cold, controlled rage begin to circulate in her blood, matching the rhythm of the Roman 4 drip. The primary data stream was a lie, sir. Thorne was modulating the pulse to bypass the bridge's safety margins. He wasn't testing the bridge. He was breaking it. If I hadn't pulled that device, the North Span would be at the bottom of the Cooper River, and there'd be a woman and her 6-year-old son down there with it. Halloway stepped closer, the light catching the silver eagles on his shoulders. There is no record of a woman and a child on the bridge, Chief. The South Carolina Highway Patrol logs show the span was cleared 20 minutes before the weather event. Any civilians you think you saw are considered a hallucination brought on by the electrical discharge you suffered while tampering with government property. The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against Elena's chest. This was the institution responding. This was the machine protecting its own gears. They weren't just punishing her. They were erasing the reality of what she had done. They were turning a rescue into a delusion and a catastrophe into a field test. It was the most efficient way to handle a dirt warrant who had seen too much. It turned her heroism into a liability and her competence into a psychiatric symptom. "Where is Tug?" Elena asked, her voice dropping into a register that made Holloway's eyes narrow. "Mr. Patterson is currently being detained at Joint Base Charleston," Holloway said. "His security clearance has been suspended. Given his civilian status, the legal ramifications for his involvement are complicated. He's being cooperative, or at least he was until he was told that you were facing a general court-martial for dereliction of duty and destruction of government property." "He wouldn't turn," Elena said. It wasn't a question. "No," Holloway admitted, and for the first time a flicker of something like respect, or perhaps just annoyance, crossed his face. "He hasn't said a word, but silence is a confession in its own way, Chief. It just makes the process take longer, and the process is going to be very long for both of you." Holloway reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a digital recorder. He set it on the bedside table, the small red light blinking like a predatory eye. "I'm here to offer you a way out of the 15-6, Elena. A way to avoid the brig. You sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the seismic research conducted by the Advanced Projects Group. You accept a medical discharge based on the injuries you sustained in what we will call a training accident at Fort Calloway. You walk away with your pension intact, and Mr. Patterson walks away with a slap on the wrist and a job in a different sector." "And the truth about the Ravenel?" Elena asked. "The truth about Thorne using an American city as a laboratory?" "The truth is whatever the final report says it is," Holloway said. "And the final report is being written by people who outrank you by several orders of magnitude. Don't be a martyr for a bridge that's already been repaired, Vance. You're a smart woman. You know how load paths work. You know that if you put too much weight on a single point, the whole structure fails. You are that point right now. Sign the papers, and we redistribute the weight." Elena looked at her bandaged hands. She could feel the wiring of the room, the way the tension in Holloway's jaw signaled his discomfort, the way the air conditioning hummed with a slight imbalance in the fan motor, the way the hospital bed's frame was slightly out of alignment. She saw the world in vectors of force and points of failure. Holloway was a force, but he wasn't the foundation. He was just another cable under tension, trying to hold up a ceiling that was already starting to crack. "I won't sign," she said. Holloway didn't move. He didn't even blink. "Then you've just signed your own warrant, Chief. The JAG officers will be here at 1800. I'd suggest you use the time to think about what life looks like when the Army is no longer your home. Because by the time they're done with you, you won't even be a memory in the motor pool." He picked up the recorder and walked out, the door clicking shut with that same clinical precision. Elena was alone in the quiet. The cost was arriving now, not in a sudden burst, but in the slow, agonizing realization of what separation actually meant. The Army wasn't just her career, it was her language. It was the way she understood the world. To be erased from it was to be rendered mute. She looked at the Roman 4 bag again, watching the drop fall. 1, 2, 3. She was counting the seconds until the JAG officers arrived, but she was also counting the cost of the woman she was becoming. 4 hours later, the door opened again. It wasn't the JAG officers. It was a nurse, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read *Sarah*. She didn't look at Elena's chart. She moved to the side of the bed and began checking the bandages on Elena's hands with a gentleness that felt out of place in a room that had just hosted a professional execution. "How's the pain?" Sarah asked, her voice a soft murmur. "Managed," Elena said. The nurse leaned in closer, her back to the door's observation window. As she unwrapped the gauze on Elena's right hand, she slipped a small, folded piece of paper into Elena's palm. It was a movement so practiced, so fluid, that it wouldn't have been caught on any security camera. "A man came by earlier," the nurse whispered, her eyes focused on the burn marks on Elena's skin. "Big guy, scars on his arms. He couldn't get past the guards at the elevator, but he told me he was your brother, said you'd know what this was." The nurse finished the dressing, gave Elena a quick, tight-lipped smile, and left the room without another word. Elena waited until she heard the nurse's footsteps fade down the hall. She carefully unfolded the paper with her trembling fingers. It wasn't a note. It was a receipt from a local Charleston coffee shop, dated that afternoon. On the back, in Tug's blocky, unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words: Asterisk, the kid is okay. Keep the frequency. Asterisk, Elena closed her eyes, her breath hitching in her throat. The kid was okay. The boy she had pulled from the edge of the abyss was alive, and despite the Army's best efforts to gaslight her, he was real. Tug had found him. He had risked a federal detention facility to get that message to her, to let her know that the mission, the real mission, had been a success. Keep the frequency, she whispered. It was a reminder. The data. The thumb drive Tug had pulled from the seismic logs at Fort Calloway. They didn't have it. Thorne's team had been so focused on scrubbing the bridge site and erasing Elena that they'd forgotten the original source. Or perhaps they assumed it was in the bag that had fallen into the pylon's core. But Tug had kept it. He had the wiring of the conspiracy tucked away in a boot or a pocket, waiting for the right moment to ground the charge. But as the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the hospital room, the personal cost of that truth began to settle in full. Elena tried to stand to test her knee, but the moment her foot hit the floor, her leg buckled. She collapsed back onto the bed, a groan of frustration escaping her lips. She was a dirt warrant who couldn't even stand up. She was a structural expert whose own chassis was failing. She thought about the bridge. She thought about the way the concrete had groaned under the resonance. She realized that she was in the same state as the Ravenel. The primary supports were shattered. The tension was uneven, and she was being held together by the equivalent of frayed cables and a few stubborn bolts. She wasn't just fighting the Army. She was fighting her own body's desire to quit. At 1800, the door opened for the third time. 2 men in class uniforms entered, followed by a woman in a dark suit who carried a leather briefcase like a weapon. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like accountants of human misery. "Chief Warrant Officer 3 Elena Vance," the woman said, opening her briefcase and laying out a stack of documents on the rolling meal tray. "I am Major Aris from the Office of the Judge Advocate General. We are here to serve you with a formal notice of investigation and a preliminary order of administrative separation under less than honorable conditions." Elena didn't look at the papers. She looked at the Major's eyes. They were gray and empty, the eyes of someone who had long ago traded their soul for a seat at the table. "You are being charged with 3 counts of Article 92, failure to obey a lawful order," the Major continued, her voice a monotonous drone. "1 count of Article 108, destruction of government property, and 1 count of Article 133, conduct unbecoming an officer. Given the nature of the classified research involved, this hearing will be closed to the public and your legal counsel will be limited to military-appointed representatives with top-secret clearance." "And the evidence?" Elena asked. "The seismic logs, the testimony of the civilian on the bridge." "There are no seismic logs," the Major said, not even glancing up from her paperwork. "The equipment at Fort Calloway experienced a catastrophic failure during the storm. And as for the civilian, as Colonel Holloway previously informed you, there is no record of anyone being on the bridge. You are being processed based on the eyewitness accounts of Dr. Thorne and his security detail, all of whom state that you suffered a psychotic break during a high-stress training exercise and attempted to sabotage a critical national security project." Elena felt the toothache return, a sharp, rhythmic throb at the base of her skull. It wasn't a resonance this time. It was the sound of the door closing on her life. They had everything. They had the witnesses, the authority, and the ability to rewrite the very laws of physics to suit their narrative. They were the load-bearing wall, and she was the crack they were about to plaster over. "You have 24 hours to respond to the preliminary charges," the Major said, sliding a pen across the tray toward Elena's bandaged hand. "If you waive your right to a hearing and accept the administrative separation, the Army will agree not to pursue criminal charges in a federal court. It's a generous offer, Chief. Most people in your position don't get a choice." Elena looked at the pen. Her hand was shaking, the nerves in her palm still raw and screaming. She could sign it. She could walk away, take the less-than-honorable discharge, and spend the rest of her life in a quiet house in the mountains, trying to forget the sound of a bridge screaming. She could be safe. She could be forgotten. She thought about Tug, sitting in a windowless room at Joint Base Charleston, refusing to speak. She thought about the woman on the bridge, the way she had looked at Elena as if she were an angel made of rain and steel. She thought about the wiring, the hidden connections that held the world together, the things that no one else saw but her. She picked up the pen. Major Aris leaned forward, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. She thought she had won. She thought the dirt warrant had finally hit her breaking point. Elena didn't sign the paper. She didn't even touch the line. Instead, she wrote 3 numbers on the top of the document in bold, black ink. Asterisk 62. 4 asterisk. The major frowned. What is this? That's the frequency of the pulse Thorne was using to break the pylon, Elena said, her voice steady and cold. It's also the exact frequency of the cooling fans in the server room at the Pentagon's annex. If I can break a bridge with it, Major, imagine what I can do to a network. Tell Thorne that I'm not signing anything, and tell him that the dirt warrant still has the schematics for the entire Foundation. The Major's smile vanished. She snatched the paper back, her eyes flicking to the numbers as if they were a live grenade. She didn't say another word. She signaled to the 2 guards, packed her briefcase, and marched out of the room, her heels clicking like a countdown on the linoleum floor. Elena sank back into the pillows, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had just declared war on the most powerful institution on Earth with nothing but a pen and a memory of a sound. She was terrified. She was broken. She was alone. But as the darkness of the Charleston night swallowed the room, she felt a small, flickering spark of hope in the center of her chest. It was the same spark she felt when she found the 1 bolt that was holding up 1,000 tons of steel. It was small. It was fragile. But it was there. The institution was responding, but the wiring was starting to fray. In the days that followed, the hospital became a fortress. The guards outside Elena's door were replaced by MPs in full tactical gear, and her phone privileges were revoked. The doctors who treated her were stone-faced and silent, performing their duties with a robotic efficiency that left no room for questions. She was being quarantined, not for a virus, but for the truth she carried. Her knee began to heal, a slow, itchy process that required her to spend hours in a brace, staring at the walls. Her hands were still scarred, the skin mottled and sensitive to the touch, but the strength was returning to her fingers. She spent her time visualizing the Ravenel, mentally reconstructing the pylon, the cables, and the dampers. She looked for the weakness in Thorne's narrative, the same way she looked for the weakness in a concrete slab. The reckoning for the authority figures was happening, though she couldn't see it directly. She heard it in the snippets of conversation from the hallway, the mention of internal reviews, the arrival of special investigators from D.C., the rumors of a high-ranking official at Fort Calloway being reassigned to a desk job in Alaska. Thorne's experiment hadn't just put a bridge at risk. It had exposed a fault line in the military's relationship with private contractors. The Army loved the technology Thorne provided, but they hated the liability he created. One afternoon, a week after the incident, the door opened to reveal a man she didn't recognize. He wasn't in uniform. He wore a rumpled corduroy jacket and smelled of stale tobacco and cheap coffee. He looked like a university professor who had lost his way, but the way he scanned the room for bugs told Elena he was something else entirely. "Chief Vance," he said, pulling a chair to the side of her bed without being asked. "I'm Special Agent Miller with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. I'm the man they send when the Army tries to investigate itself and fails." Elena didn't move. "I've already spoken to JAG, Agent Miller. I have nothing more to say." "JAG is interested in the law, Chief. I'm interested in the physics," Miller said, leaning forward, his eyes bright behind thick glasses. "I've seen the weather report for the Ravenel. It's a fascinating piece of fiction, but I've also seen the seismic logs from the Charleston Harbor Authority. They picked up a 62, 4 Hertz vibration that didn't come from the wind. It came from the pylon, and it stopped exactly 30 seconds after a classified device was reported lost in the tower." Elena felt a jolt of adrenaline. "You have the logs?" "I have a lot of things, Chief, including a very interesting recording from a maintenance hoist inside the south pylon. It's mostly wind and static, but there's a voice on it. A woman's voice. She's talking about load paths and unzipping the span. And then there's another voice. A man named Thorne, telling her to let the bridge fall for the sake of the data." Miller leaned back, his expression turning grim. "The problem is, Thorne has friends in very high places. Friends who believe that a little collateral damage is a fair price to pay for a weaponized resonance system that can take down a bridge from 10 miles away without firing a single shot. They want you gone, Elena. They want you silenced, buried, and forgotten, and they're willing to burn your entire career to make it happen." "So why are you here?" Elena asked. "To tell me I'm doomed?" "I'm here to tell you that you're not as alone as you think," Miller said. There are people in the Pentagon who are tired of contractors like Thorne treating the world like a sandbox. They can't help you directly, not yet, but they can give you a lever. If you can provide the physical evidence of the modulation, the smoking gun that proves Thorne wasn't just observing the bridge but actively destroying it, we can turn this 15-6 into a congressional hearing. The evidence is with Tug, Elena said. He's being held at the joint base. Miller shook his head. Not anymore. They moved him this morning. They're taking him to a black site in Virginia. If he gets on that plane, Chief, he's gone. And the thumb drive goes with him. Elena felt the world tilt. Tug was the only person who saw her clearly. He was her anchor, her partner, the one man who had stood by her when the world was falling apart. If they took him, they didn't just take the evidence, they took her heart. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "Hangar 4, Charleston Air Force Base. The flight leaves at 2200, Miller said, standing up. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, plastic keycard. He set it on the bedside table. "This gets you out of the medical wing and into the parking garage. There's a silver Dodge Charger in spot 42B. The keys are under the wheel well. What you do with that information is up to you, Chief. But if you're going to move, you have to do it now. Once he's in the air, the wiring of this thing becomes permanent." Miller walked out without looking back, leaving Elena alone with the keycard and the impossible choice. She looked at her knee. It was still stiff, the joint protesting every movement. She looked at her hands, the scars a permanent reminder of what the truth had already cost her. She was a soldier who had been stripped of her rank, her dignity, and her future. She was a woman who was supposed to be in a hospital bed, awaiting her own professional execution. But as she touched the keycard, she felt a different kind of tension. Not the tension of a bridge under load, but the tension of a spring that had been compressed to its limit. She wasn't going to wait for the JAG officers. She wasn't going to wait for the 15-6 to bury her. She was a dirt warrant, and she knew exactly how to find the flaw in their foundation. She stood up. The pain in her knee was a white-hot flare, but she pushed through it, her face a mask of controlled, icy determination. She stripped off her hospital gown and found her ox in the small closet by the door. They were torn, stained with salt and grease, but as she pulled them on, she felt the weight of her identity returning. She wasn't Elena Vance, the psychiatric patient. She was Elena Vance, the woman who had saved the bridge. She made it out of the room with the practiced stealth of a ghost. The MPs were at the end of the hall, distracted by a delivery of late-night pizza. She used the keycard at the service elevator, her heart hammering against her ribs as the doors slid shut. The hospital was a maze of fluorescent lights and sterile smells, but she moved through it with a singular focus. Every step was a battle against her own body, every breath a choice to keep going. She reached the parking garage, the air heavy with the scent of exhaust and damp concrete. The silver Charger was exactly where Miller said it would be. She found the keys, climbed into the driver's seat, and felt the engine roar to life under her hands. It was a powerful, aggressive sound, a stark contrast to the silence of the hospital. She looked at the clock on the dashboard. 21:14, 46 minutes until the plane left. She didn't think about the legal ramifications. She didn't think about the court-martial or the federal prison that awaited her. She only thought about Tug, sitting in the back of a blacked-out van, and the thumb drive that held the truth of 1,000 lives. She pulled out of the garage, the tires screaming against the concrete, and headed for the base. The drive to Charleston Air Force Base was a blur of rain and neon. Elena drove with a dark competence, her mind calculating the fastest route, the security checkpoints, the wiring of the base's perimeter. She knew she couldn't just blast through the front gate. She needed a way in that didn't involve a gunfight. She remembered a secondary access road near the fuel farm, a gravel track used by the civilian contractors who maintained the drainage systems. It was a weak point in the base's structural integrity, a place where the fencing was old and the sensors were prone to false alarms during heavy rain. She found the track, the Charger bouncing over the ruts, the headlights cutting through the gloom. She reached the fence, killed the engine, and stepped out into the mud. The rain was back, a cold, relentless drizzle that soaked through her uniform in seconds. She reached into the back seat and grabbed a pair of wire cutters she'd found in the glove box. Miller had thought of everything. She cut through the chain link with a rhythmic asterisk, snap, 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 asterisk. Her hands steady despite the cold. She squeezed through the gap, her knees screaming in protest, and found herself on the edge of the tarmac. Hangar 4 loomed in the distance, a massive, windowless cavern of corrugated steel. A small, twin-engine transport plane sat on the apron, its engines already whining as it prepped for takeoff. A black Suburban and two military police cruisers were parked near the boarding ramp, their lights flashing in the dark. Elena moved through the shadows of the fuel tanks, her eyes fixed on the Suburban. She saw two men in tactical gear step out, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They reached into the back of the vehicle and pulled out a man whose hands were zip-tied behind his back and whose head was covered by a black hood. Tug. Even from 100 yards away, Elena recognized the way he stood, the defiant set of his shoulders, the refusal to slump even under the weight of his captors. He was her anchor, and they were trying to cast him into the deep. "Not today," she whispered. She didn't have a weapon, and she didn't have a plan. All she had was her understanding of the world's wiring and the knowledge that every system had a failure point. She looked at the hangar. She saw the massive electrical transformer that fed the runway lights and the hangar's internal systems. It was a high-voltage unit, perched on a concrete pad 50 yards from the plane. She remembered the frequency. 62.4. She moved toward the transformer, her boots sinking into the wet grass. She reached the control box, her fingers fumbling with the lock. She used the wire cutters as a pry bar, the metal groaning until the door swung open. Inside was a maze of breakers, relays, and copper bus bars. It was the heart of the hangar's power grid, and it was currently humming with a steady 60 hertz drone. Elena didn't want to shut the power off. She wanted to modulate it. She found the manual override for the frequency stabilizer. It was a small, rotary dial used for maintenance testing. She gripped it with her bandaged hand, the pain a sharp reminder of the last time she'd played with electricity. She turned the dial. 60, 5, 61, 0, 61, 8. The hum of the transformer changed, shifting into a higher, more frantic pitch. The runway lights began to flicker, their steady glow turning into a rhythmic strobe. 62, 4. The resonance hit. The corrugated steel of Hangar 4 began to vibrate, a low-frequency groan that echoed across the tarmac. The MPs near the plane stopped, looking around in confusion as the ground beneath their feet began to thrum. The transport plane's engines coughed, the sensitive electronics in the cockpit reacting to the dirty power surging through the ground start cables. The pilot's voice crackled over the base's radio frequency, a frantic question about the grid stability. Elena didn't stop. She pushed the dial further, searching for the sweet spot, the frequency that would trigger the fire suppression system inside the hangar. The vibration intensified. A piece of the hangar's siding tore loose and clattered onto the tarmac. The runway lights suddenly flared bright white and then shattered, plunging the apron into a strobe-lit chaos. Inside the hangar, the massive overhead sprinklers suddenly activated, triggered by the vibration-sensitive fire sensors. A wall of foam and water erupted from the ceiling, drenching the MPs and the security detail. The chaos was instantaneous. The guards near the Suburban dove for cover, their rifles useless in the sudden deluge of fire-retardant foam. The transport plane's engines died with a final metallic wheeze as the ground start cable shorted out. Elena ran. She ignored the agony in her knee. She ignored the cold and the rain. She burst from the shadows and sprinted toward the Suburban, her eyes locked on Tug. The guards were blinded by the foam, their tactical gear covered in white, slippery sludge. One of them saw her and reached for his sidearm, but he slipped on the foam-slicked pavement, his gun sliding away into the dark. Elena reached Tug. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the shadows of the fuel farm. "Elena!" Tug's voice was a muffled roar from under the hood. "I got you, Tug, I got you." She pulled the hood from his head. His face was bruised, his eyes bloodshot, but when he saw her, a grin broke across his face that was brighter than any runway light. "I knew you'd find the wiring, Chief," he rasped. "The thumb drive, Tug, do you have it?" He didn't say a word. He reached into his mouth and pulled out a small, plastic-wrapped object he'd been hiding under his tongue. He spat it into her hand, the thumb drive, covered in saliva and grit but intact. "Let's get out of here," he said. They turned to run, but as they did, a searchlight suddenly flared from the top of the hangar, cutting through the foam and the rain. "Chief Vance, stand down." The voice came from a loudspeaker, amplified and distorted by the resonance. It wasn't an MP. It was Thorne. He was standing on the hangar's observation deck, his silhouette a dark, jagged shape against the strobing lights. He held a radio in one hand and a silenced pistol in the other. "You're interfering with a Department of Defense transport, Elena," Thorne shouted. "You've gone from sabotage to treason. Give me the drive and I'll make sure you reach the brig alive." Elena looked at the drive in her hand, then at Tug. They were trapped on the open tarmac, the MPs beginning to recover, the searchlight tracking their every move. The wiring of the moment was clear. They had the truth, but they had no ground. They were under maximum tension, and the failure point was only seconds away. Tug, the car, Elena whispered. It's near the fuel farm. If we can reach it, we can get to Miller. Go, Elena, Tug said, stepping in front of her, his massive frame a shield. I'll draw their fire, you get the drive to the DSIS. No, Tug, we go together. Chief, that's an order, he roared, forgetting for a second that he was a civilian. A shot rang out, the quiet asterisk thwip asterisk of a suppressed round. Tug flinched as the bullet grazed his shoulder, but he didn't go down. Go. Elena turned and ran toward the fuel tanks, the drive clutched in her fist. She felt the searchlight on her back, the cold weight of the institution's fury chasing her through the dark. She reached the charger, her lungs burning, her heart a drumbeat of terror and rage. She climbed in, started the engine, and looked back at the hangar. She saw Tug being swarmed by the MPs, his body disappearing under a wave of black uniforms. She saw Thorne standing on the observation deck, watching her with a clinical, predatory interest. She could leave him. She could drive away, deliver the evidence, and let the machinery of justice take care of the rest. But as she looked at the wiring of her own soul, she knew she couldn't do it. She couldn't leave her anchor behind. She shifted the car into gear, but she didn't head for the gate. She headed for the hangar. The personal cost was arriving in full. She was Elena Vance. She was a soldier, and she was about to show the world what happens when you try to break a structure that was built to last. The Charger's tires screamed as she accelerated across the tarmac, the foam flying from the wheels like a wake. She wasn't just driving, she was calculating the force, the angle, and the impact. The reckoning was coming, and this time she was the one who was going to set the frequency. The silver Dodge Charger didn't just accelerate, it lunged, the rear tires fighting for purchase on the foam-slicked tarmac of Joint Base Charleston. Elena Vance gripped the wheel with her bandaged hands, the pain in her palms now a secondary signal, a distant alarm she had successfully tuned out. She wasn't driving toward the MPs who were pinning Tug to the ground. She was driving toward the geometry of the hangar itself. She saw the building not as a fortress of corrugated steel and I-beams, but as a series of load-bearing vectors currently under extreme duress. The 62, 4 Hz resonance she had pumped into the transformer was still radiating through the foundation, and the hangar was humming like a tuning fork. She knew where the kingpin was. Every massive structure had one. The single point where the most tension converged, the bolt or the weld that, if compromised, would cause the rest of the system to redistribute its weight in a catastrophic ripple. In Hangar 4, it was the support column for the observation deck where Thorne was standing. If she could hit the base of that column with the right mass and the right velocity, the vibration already running through the floor would do the rest of the work for her. She shifted into third gear, the engine's scream matching the whine of the dying transport plane. The MPs saw her coming. One of them, a young corporal with foam-white goggles, raised his hand to signal her to stop, but he dived out of the way a second later as the Charger's grill filled his vision. Elena didn't flinch. She wasn't trying to kill anyone. She was trying to ground the circuit. She felt the impact before she heard it. A sickening, heavy crunch of American steel meeting reinforced concrete. The airbag didn't deploy. She'd had the foresight to pull the fuse while she was idling near the fence. Her head snapped forward, the seatbelt cutting into her collarbone, but she kept her foot on the gas, the tires spinning and smoking against the floor. The hangar groaned. It was a deep, guttural sound, the sound of a mountain moving. The resonance she had induced through the transformer had already weakened the anchor bolts of the column. Her impact was the final decimal point in the equation. Above her, the observation deck shuddered. Thorne lost his balance, his silenced pistol skittering across the metal floor. He grabbed the railing, his face a mask of sudden, frantic terror as he realized the dirt warrant hadn't just attacked him. She had rewritten the physics of the room. The observation deck tilted 5 degrees, then 10. The metal groaned, a high-pitched scream of shearing rivets that echoed through the cavernous space. The fire suppression foam continued to fall, a white shroud covering the wreckage. In the sudden shift of tension, the MPs holding Tug were thrown off balance. Tug, seeing his opening, didn't run. He surged upward, using his massive shoulders to heave the 2 guards off him. He didn't look at Thorne, he didn't look at the plane. He looked at the silver car pinned against the column. Elena kicked the driver's side door open. It resisted at first, the frame bent from the impact, but she slammed her shoulder against it until the metal yielded. She stumbled out into the foam, her knee buckling. The world was a spinning mess of strobe lights, white sludge, and the smell of ozone. "Elena!" Tug was there, his hands still zip-tied, but his movements fast and purposeful. He knelt beside her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're crazy, you know that. You're absolutely out of your mind." "Get the knife," she rasped, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out the small folding blade she'd taken from the Charger's console and sliced through his ties. Tug stood up, rubbing his wrists. Above them, the deck continued to groan, but the collapse had stalled. The structure had found a new, precarious equilibrium. Thorne was still up there, clinging to the tilted railing, but he was no longer a predator. He was a man trapped in a trap of his own making. "We have the drive," Elena said, her voice shaking but her eyes clear. "We have to go, now." They didn't make it 20 feet before the perimeter of the hangar was flooded with light. Not the strobing, flickering light of the failing grid, but the steady, overwhelming glare of high-intensity tactical lamps. "Federal agents, drop your weapons, everyone down on the ground." It wasn't the MPs. It wasn't Thorne's security detail. 3 black subs roared onto the tarmac, followed by 2 Humvees with the markings of the 10th Mountain Division. Men in tactical gear with DSIS and SID patches erupted from the vehicles, their movements precise and overwhelming. Elena sank to her knees, not because she was surrendering, but because her body finally refused to carry the load any further. She felt Tug's hand on her shoulder, a steady, heavy weight. Agent Miller stepped out of the lead SUV. He wasn't wearing his corduroy jacket anymore. He was in a windbreaker with DSIS emblazoned on the back in gold letters. He didn't look at Thorne or the wreckage of the hangar. He walked straight toward Elena and Tug. "You took your time," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper over the sound of the rain. Miller looked at the silver Charger, then at the tilted observation deck. He shook his head, a ghost of a smile appearing on his tired face. "I told you to take the car, Chief. I didn't tell you to use it as a demolition ball." "The drive is here," she said, holding out her hand. Miller took the small, saliva-stained piece of plastic with the reverence of a man handling a holy relic. "This is the wiring, isn't it? The proof that Thorne was modulating the pulse." "It's all there," Tug said. "The logs, the overrides, the communication with Calloway." He was going to let the Ravenel fall just to see if his math was right. Miller signaled to his team, "Secure Dr. Thorne, and get a medical team over here for Chief Vance." As the medics approached, Elena watched the MPs. They were standing down, their rifles lowered, as the CID officers began to strip them of their gear. The institution was finally turning on its own rot. But as she saw Colonel Holloway emerge from one of the subs, his face a mask of cold, bureaucratic indifference, she knew the reckoning wouldn't be as clean as she wanted. Holloway didn't look at the wreckage. He didn't look at the injured soldiers. He walked straight to Miller. "This is a massive breach of protocol, Miller," Holloway said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "You have no jurisdiction over a classified Department of Defense field test." "This wasn't a test, Colonel," Miller replied, not even looking up from the thumb drive. "It was a crime, and as for jurisdiction, I'm acting under a direct mandate from the Office of the Inspector General. You might want to call your lawyer, or better yet, call the governor. Tell him why you nearly dropped 3,000 tons of steel on his city." Holloway's eyes flicked to Elena. For a moment, the mask slipped, and she saw the pure, unadulterated hatred of a man who had been outplayed by someone he considered a tool. He didn't say a word. He turned on his heel and walked back toward his vehicle, his silhouette sharp and predatory in the rain. "He'll walk," Elena said, watching him go. "Maybe," Miller said, turning back to her. "But he won't walk back into a command, and Thorne is going to spend the next 20 years explaining his resonance theories to a federal judge." The medics put Elena on a stretcher. As they lifted her, she looked up at the gray, rain-streaked sky. The toothache in her head was gone. The resonance had stopped. The world was quiet again, the only sound the steady, rhythmic beat of the rain on the hangar roof. The weeks that followed were a blurred progression of hospital rooms, interrogation chambers, and legal briefings. Elena's recovery was slow. The burns on her hands required skin grafts, and her knee would never fully regain its original range of motion. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the slow, agonizing unzipping of her career. The Army did what the Army always does when faced with a scandal. It localized the damage. Thorne was the villain. Holloway was the misguided commander who had been misled by a civilian contractor. And Elena, Elena was the hero who had nonetheless violated a dozen articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice to save the day. She sat in a small, windowless room at Fort Belvoir, 3 months after the night at the hangar. She was wearing her class A uniform, her ribbons straight, her brass polished to a mirror finish. Across from her sat a board of 3 officers, their faces unreadable. Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vance. The presiding officer, a brigadier general named Sarah Vance, no relation, said, "This board has reviewed the findings of the 15-6 investigation into the events at the Ravenel Bridge and Joint Base Charleston. We have also reviewed the testimony of Special Agent Miller and the data recovered from the seismic logs." Elena sat perfectly still. She didn't look at her hands, which were now covered in thin, silvery scars. She didn't look at Tug, who was waiting in the hallway. She looked at the general. "The evidence is clear that your actions prevented a catastrophic loss of life," the general continued. "It is also clear that Dr. Thorne acted with criminal negligence and intent. His contract with the Department of Defense has been terminated, and he is currently awaiting trial on multiple federal charges." The general paused, shifting a stack of papers. "However, the Army cannot overlook the methods you used. You abandoned your post. You commandeered government property. You bypassed secure systems. You engaged in a high-speed pursuit on a military installation. If we allow this to go unpunished, we undermine the very chain of command that holds this institution together." "I understand, ma'am," Elena said. Her voice was steady, devoid of any plea or excuse. "The board has decided to offer you a choice," the general said. "We can proceed with a general court-martial, which will likely result in a dishonorable discharge and a prison sentence. Or you can accept an administrative separation under honorable conditions, effective immediately. You will retain your pension and your medical benefits, but your time in the United States Army is over." The silence in the room was a physical weight. Elena thought about the motor pool. She thought about the smell of diesel and the sound of a perfectly tuned engine. She thought about the wiring of the world and how the Army had been the only language she ever knew. "I accept the separation," she said. The general nodded, a flicker of something like regret crossing her face. "Very well, Chief Vance, you are dismissed, and for what it's worth, thank you for the bridge." Elena stood up, saluted for the last time, and walked out of the room. Tug was waiting for her near the exit. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, looking more like the mountain man he was than the contractor he had been. He didn't ask how it went. He saw it in the way she carried her shoulders. "Where to?" he asked, taking her small bag. "Out," she said. "Just out." They walked out of the building and into the bright, sharp sunlight of a Virginia autumn. The air was crisp, the smell of decaying leaves and wood smoke a far cry from the humidity of Charleston. They drove for hours, heading west toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. Elena sat in the passenger seat of Tug's old Ford, watching the world go by. She saw the telephone poles, the way the wires sagged between them in a perfect catenary curve. She saw the bridges over the small creeks, the way the concrete abutments showed the marks of decades of seasonal expansion and contraction. She saw the world in its true form, not as a collection of objects, but as a system of balance and tension. They stopped at a small overlook as the sun began to set, the mountains turning a deep, bruised purple. Elena stepped out of the truck, the wind catching her hair. She felt the ground beneath her feet, the solid, unyielding foundation of the earth. "What now, Elena?" Tug asked, leaning against the tailgate. "I don't know," she said. "I've never not been a soldier." "You're still a soldier," Tug said. "You just don't have a commander anymore." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He handed it to her. It was a piece of the Ravenel, a small, twisted shard of the pylon's reinforcement steel that he'd found in the wreckage of the Charger. "A reminder," he said, "that you were right, even when everyone told you that you were crazy." Elena held the steel in her scarred palm. It was cold and heavy, a physical anchor to the truth. She thought about the woman and the boy on the bridge. She'd never seen them again. They didn't know her name. They didn't know about the resonance or the 62, 4 hertz pulse. They were just living their lives, unaware that they had been the center of a storm that had nearly torn the world apart. That was the cost. That was the mission. You saved the people who would never know they needed saving, and you did it because it was the only thing worth doing. "I think I want to build something," she said, her voice a low, steady murmur. "Not just fix things that are breaking. I want to build something that lasts. I know a guy in Montana who needs a structural lead on a dam project," Tug said, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. He's a bit of a grouch, but he values competence above everything else, and the wiring is complicated. Elena looked at him, and for the first time in months she felt the toothache fade entirely. There was a new frequency in the air, a steady, rhythmic hum that didn't come from a machine or a bridge. It came from the future. Montana, she said, testing the word. I've always liked the geography there, good bedrock, solid foundations. Let's go then, Tug said. They got back into the truck and headed west, leaving the ghosts of the army and the shadows of Charleston behind them. 6 months later, Elena Vance stood on the edge of a half-finished dam in the Bitterroot Valley. The wind was howling off the peaks, the air tasting of pine and snow. She was wearing a hard hat and a heavy canvas coat, a set of blueprints clutched in her scarred hands. The project was behind schedule. The concrete pour had been delayed by a late spring freeze, and the main contractor was worried about the tension in the diversion tunnel's temporary supports. He was a man named Miller, no relation to the agent, who had spent 40 years building things and still didn't trust the math. It's not going to hold, Vance, Miller shouted over the roar of the water. Look at the vibration in those jacks. The whole thing is going to unzip if we don't back off. Elena didn't look at the jacks. She didn't look at the gauges. She walked to the edge of the tunnel, closed her eyes, and placed her hand on the cold, wet concrete. She felt the resonance. It was there, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated through her marrow, but it wasn't a destructive pulse. It was the sound of the structure settling into its own weight. The tension was high, yes, but it was evenly distributed. The wiring was holding. She opened her eyes and looked at the foreman. It's not unzipping, Miller. It's breathing. Give it another 4 hours for the thermal expansion to level out and then start the pour. And if you're wrong? I'm not wrong, she said. She stayed on the dam until the sun went down, watching the concrete flow into the forms, a gray, liquid foundation for something that would stand for 100 years. She felt the weight of the mountain pressing against her, the massive, silent force of the water held back by her design. As she walked back to her truck, she saw a small, silver car parked in the lot. It wasn't a Charger. It was a sensible, four-wheel drive SUV, the kind of vehicle a woman needs in the mountains. But on the dashboard, tucked next to the GPS, was a small, twisted piece of American steel. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it in her hand. She thought about the Ravenel. She thought about the silence of the hospital room and the cold eyes of Colonel Holloway. She thought about the cost of being right and the price of being a soldier. She looked out over the valley, where the lights of the small town below were starting to flicker on like stars. She felt the rhythm of the world, the expansion and contraction, the tension and the release, the endless, beautiful complexity of things held together by nothing but faith and physics. She wasn't a dirt warrant anymore. She wasn't a psychiatric patient or a liability. She was Elena Vance, and she knew exactly how much the bridge could carry. She put the steel back on the dashboard, started the engine, and drove home. The road was long and the mountains were steep, but the foundation was solid. The next morning, Elena arrived at the site before the sun had cleared the peaks. The air was so cold it felt like glass in her lungs, and the silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic clatter of a jackhammer waking up somewhere in the diversion tunnel. She walked to the center of the dam, her boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel. She looked at the pour from the night before. The concrete had set beautifully, a smooth, gray expanse that looked as if it had always been part of the mountain. She knelt and pressed her hand against the surface. It was cold, but beneath the surface she could still feel the residual heat of the chemical reaction, the birth of a new structure. It was solid. It was grounded. Tug arrived a few minutes later, carrying 2 thermoses of coffee. He didn't say anything. He just handed her one and stood beside her, looking out at the water. They had been in Montana for half a year, and in that time they had become a team that didn't need words. They were the people you called when the math didn't match the reality. They were the ones who saw the wiring. Miller is happy, Tug said finally, his voice a low rumble. He says the tension in the tunnel dropped exactly where you said it would. He thinks you're a witch. It's just physics, Tug, Elena said, taking a sip of the bitter, hot coffee. The world wants to be in balance. You just have to show it where the center is. Most people spend their whole lives trying to find the center, Elena. Not many of them ever do. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun hit the peaks, turning the snow into a blinding, brilliant white. It was a different kind of life than the one she had known in the army. There were no uniforms, no ranks, no classified briefings, but the stakes were just as high. If she failed here, the valley would flood. If she failed here, the work of 1,000 men would be washed away. The responsibility didn't weigh her down, it anchored her. It gave her a reason to wake up in the cold and a reason to keep her hands steady. As they walked back toward the construction trailer, Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw an encrypted message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat, a conditioned response from a life she thought she'd left behind. She opened the message. It was a single image, a photograph of a bridge in a different part of the world, a massive, cable-stayed span that looked like a younger sibling of the Ravenel. Beneath the photo were 2 words, asterisk frequency needed. Asterisk Elena stared at the screen for a moment. She looked at the scars on her hands, the silver lines that told the story of the Ravenel and the hangar and the cost of the truth. She looked at Tug, who was watching her with a quiet, knowing expression. She didn't delete the message, but she didn't reply either. She put the phone back in her pocket and looked up at the dam. The cranes were starting to move, their long shadows stretching across the valley like the hands of a clock. The world was full of bridges that were breaking and structures that were built on lies. But here in this valley, she was building something that was true. "Everything okay?" Tug asked. "Yeah," Elena said, her voice clear and firm. "Everything is exactly where it's supposed to be." She walked into the trailer and picked up her blueprints. She had work to do. She had a dam to finish, a valley to protect, and a life to live that was defined not by what she had lost, but by what she was capable of. The toothache was gone. The resonance was quiet. The story of Elena Vance didn't end with a medal or a court-martial. It didn't end with a grand speech or a public vindication. It ended in a quiet valley in Montana, where a woman with scarred hands and a brilliant mind stood against the wind and made sure the world stayed in balance. She was a soldier who had found her own command. She was an engineer who had found her own foundation. And as the day began in earnest, the sound of the construction site, the grinding of gears, the roar of engines, the rhythmic beat of the hammers, sounded to her like the most beautiful music in the world. It was the sound of things holding together. The afternoon sun was high when she finally stepped away from the drafting table. Her eyes were tired, the fine lines of the blueprints beginning to blur together, but the satisfaction in her chest was a steady, low-frequency hum. She had found the flaw in the secondary spillway design, a minor calculation error that would have caused a localized vibration under peak flow. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that wouldn't have caused a failure for 20 years, but she had seen it. She had corrected the wiring before the first drop of water ever touched the concrete. She walked out of the trailer and saw Miller standing by the edge of the overlook, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked older today, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the responsibility he'd carried for 4 decades. "You found it, didn't you?" he asked without turning around. "The spillway," Elena said, leaning against the railing next to him. The reinforcement spacing was off by 3 centimeters. It would have resonated at high velocity. Miller sighed, a long, weary sound that was lost in the wind. 3 centimeters. You're the only person I've ever met who would catch that on a blueprint that size, Vance. Most engineers would have let the builders figure it out in the field. "The field is too late," Elena said. "By then the tension is already built in. You have to find the failure before it happens." Miller finally looked at her, his eyes narrowed as if he were trying to see the woman behind the scars. "The army really was a bunch of fools to let you go, wasn't it? I read the reports, or at least the parts they didn't redact. They called you a liability." "I was," Elena said. "A liability is just a force that doesn't fit the design. The army has a very specific design, Miller, and I stopped fitting into it a long time ago." "Well," Miller said, turning back to the dam, "their loss is my salvation. I'm retiring after this project, Elena. My heart can't take the tension anymore. I've been looking for someone to take over the firm, someone who understands that a bridge isn't just steel and concrete, it's a promise." Elena looked at him, the weight of the offer settling over her like a heavy coat. It was a future, a real one, not a classified mission or a temporary contract, but a legacy. "I'm a dirt warrant, Miller," she said, a ghost of a smile on her face. "I don't know how to run a firm, I know how to fix things that are broken." "Exactly," Miller said. "And the world is breaking, Elena. It needs people who know how to hold it together." He walked away, leaving her alone with the view and the choice. Elena looked at the dam, the massive, gray wall that held back 1,000,000 tons of water. She felt the strength of it, the quiet power of a structure that was built right from the foundation up. She thought about the thumb drive, still tucked away in a safe in Tug's house. She thought about the message on her phone, the silent call from a world that still needed her unique, dangerous capability. She knew she would never truly be free of the wiring. She would always see the cracks, always hear the resonance, always know when the world was about to unzip. But she didn't have to be a victim of it anymore. She could be the architect. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, Elena felt a sense of peace that had been missing for years. It wasn't the peace of a soldier who had finished the war. It was the peace of a builder who had finally found the right site. She walked back to her truck, her steps steady and purposeful. She didn't look back at the dam. She didn't look back at the trailer. She looked forward, toward the small house at the end of the valley where Tug was probably already starting the fire and the coffee was already on. She was Elena Vance. She was 42 years old, and she was just getting started. The drive home was quiet, the only sound the steady hum of the tires on the asphalt. She watched the shadows of the trees dance across the hood of the truck, the light and dark creating a rhythmic pattern that matched the beating of her heart. She felt the connection to the earth, the way the road followed the contours of the land, a man-made line through a wilderness that was both beautiful and indifferent. She arrived at the house as the first stars were beginning to show. It was a small, sturdy cabin made of cedar and stone, nestled into the hillside as if it had grown there. Tug was on the porch, his boots up on the railing, a dog she'd rescued from the local shelter sleeping at his feet. "How was the spillway?" he asked, not moving. "Fixed," she said, climbing the steps. She sat down next to him, the dog lifting its head to lick her scarred hand before settling back down. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the darkness swallow the valley. It was the kind of silence that only comes when two people have nothing left to prove to each other. "I got another message today," Elena said eventually, her voice a soft murmur. Tug didn't move, but she felt his attention shift. "Same people, different frequency," she said. "They're asking about a bridge in the Balkans, a logistics route for the UN. They think someone is tampering with the dampers." Tug took a slow breath, the sound of it loud in the quiet air. "Are you going to answer?" Elena looked at her hands, the silver scars catching the light from the window. She thought about the dirt warrant she used to be. She thought about the bridge in Charleston and the boy she had pulled from the edge. "No," she said. "I'm building a dam, and after that I'm building a firm. I'm done chasing the sounds that other people make." Tug nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Good. I think Montana suits you, Elena. You look stable." "I am," she said, and she was. For the first time in her life, the load was balanced, the tension was even, the structure was sound. As she looked out into the dark, she realized that the most extraordinary hidden capability she possessed wasn't the ability to see the wiring of the world. It was the ability to survive it, to take the hits, to absorb the resonance, and to keep standing even when the system was designed to break her. She was Elena Vance, and she was the foundation. The night air grew colder, but she didn't go inside. She stayed on the porch, watching the stars, feeling the steady, rhythmic pulse of the world. It was a quiet sound, a human sound, the sound of a life being lived one breath at a time. She had lost her career, her rank, and the only home she had ever known. She had gained a future, a partner, and the knowledge that she could build something that lasted. It was a fair trade. In the end, it was the only trade that mattered. She closed her eyes and listened to the valley, the wind in the pines, the rush of the river, the distant, heavy hum of the dam. Everything was in its place. She felt the weight of the steel shard in her pocket, the last piece of the ravenel. She pulled it out and looked at it one last time. It was a piece of history, a reminder of a battle won and a life saved. But it was also just a piece of metal. It had no power over her anymore. She stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, and threw the steel out into the darkness. She heard it hit the ground somewhere in the trees, a small, final sound that was quickly swallowed by the night. She was no longer defined by the things she had saved. She was defined by the things she was building. She turned and walked into the house, the door clicking shut behind her with a quiet, solid finality. The light in the window stayed on for a while longer, a small, steady glow in the vast, dark expanse of the mountains. And then it too went out. The valley was silent. The dam was holding. The world was at rest. And in the quiet of the Montana night, Elena Vance finally slept without dreaming of falling bridges. The morning light would come soon enough, and with it the work of a new day. There were blueprints to review, concrete to pour, and a life to be built, one bolt and one beam at a time. She was ready for it. She was grounded. The dirt warrant had finally found her home. The cold weight of the Montana winter began to settle in earnest over the following weeks. turning the Bitterroot River into a ribbon of dark glass and the dam site into a fortress of ice and gray stone. Elena spent her days in the thick of it, her canvas coat stained with mud and her face chiseled by the wind. She was no longer a stranger in the valley. She was the woman who knew the mountain's secrets, the one the crews looked to when the earth groaned or the steel shivered. She had found a rhythm that the army could never have provided. It wasn't the rhythm of a drill or a deployment, but the slow, patient rhythm of creation. Every day was a battle against the elements, but it was a battle she was winning through precision and persistence rather than force. Miller had officially stepped back, leaving her in charge of the day-to-day operations. The crew had been skeptical at first, a woman with scarred hands and a quiet voice who didn't shout when things went wrong. But that skepticism had vanished the day she had climbed into the diversion tunnel during a localized tremor and told them exactly where the bedrock was shifting. She hadn't guessed, she had listened, and she had been right. Tug was her shadow, the one who handled the logistics and the men while she handled the physics. They were a singular unit, a machine of dark competence that kept the project moving even when the snow was 5 feet deep and the machines refused to start. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Elena sat in the small office trailer, her boots propped up on the space heater. The blueprints for the final phase of the dam were spread out before her, but she wasn't looking at them. She was looking at a letter that had arrived that morning. It wasn't an encrypted message. It wasn't a subpoena. It was a handwritten letter on plain white stationery postmarked from Charleston. Asterisk, Dear Chief Vance, asterisk, it began. Asterisk, you don't know me, but I was on the Ravenel Bridge that Thursday afternoon. I was the woman in the red SUV with the little boy. I wanted to write and tell you that my son, Leo, is doing well. He's starting first grade next week. Every time we drive past the bridge, he tells me that an angel made of rain saved us. I don't know about angels, but I know that I saw you. I saw your face in the mirror before the world stopped shaking. I heard what they said on the news about the weather, but I know the truth. Thank you for staying. Thank you for not letting go. Asterisk, Elena read the letter 3 times, her breath hitching in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she had needed those words until they were there in front of her, written in a stranger's neat, careful hand. The army had tried to erase the reality of that day, to turn her heroism into a hallucination, but this woman, this mother, was the physical evidence that the truth was still alive. She folded the letter and tucked it into her breast pocket, right over her heart. It was heavier than any metal and more valuable than any commendation. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the snow was falling in large, lazy flakes, illuminated by the site's floodlights. The dam looked like a sleeping giant, a massive, unyielding presence in the dark. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loyalty, not to the institution she had served, but to the world itself. To the people on the bridges, the families in the valleys, the strangers who depended on the integrity of the things they couldn't see. She was part of that integrity. She was the one who checked the bolts. She was the one who listened to the resonance. She wasn't a soldier anymore, but she had never been more of a guardian. Tug walked into the trailer, shaking the snow off his hat. He saw the look on her face and paused. "Everything okay, Elena?" "Yeah," she said, her voice thick but steady. "Everything is fine, Tug. I just got a reminder of why we do this." He walked over and stood beside her, looking out at the snow. "We do it because the wiring has to hold, Chief. Someone has to make sure it holds." "Yes," she said. "Someone has to." They stood there in the quiet trailer, 2 people who had been broken by the world and had found a way to build themselves back together. They were the outliers, the ones who saw the flaws and the fractures, but they were also the ones who knew how to bridge the gap. As the winter deepened, the dam reached its final height. The last pour was a quiet affair, attended only by the core crew and a few local officials. There were no cameras, no speeches, no ribbons, just the sound of the concrete sliding into the forms and the heavy, satisfying thud of the vibrators as they settled the mix. Elena stood on the crest of the dam, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She felt the structure beneath her feet, solid, massive, and true. It was a part of the mountain now, a new foundation for a new future. She looked out over the reservoir where the water was already starting to rise, filling the valley with a deep, dark blue. It was a reservoir of power, a reservoir of life, and she was the one who had made it possible. She thought about Thorne, sitting in a prison cell somewhere, still obsessed with the sounds of destruction. She thought about Holloway, living out his retirement in a quiet house, his legacy a series of redacted files and broken promises. They were part of the past, part of the resonance that had finally faded away. She was the present. She was the builder. As she walked back down the mountain for the last time that season, she saw a small, red SUV parked at the base of the access road. A woman and a young boy were standing next to it, looking up at the dam. Elena stopped, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't move, she didn't speak, she just watched them. The boy looked up at the massive wall of concrete and then at the woman, his face full of wonder. The woman put her hand on his shoulder, her eyes fixed on the crest of the dam where Elena had just been standing. They didn't see her. They didn't know she was there. But as they got back into their car and drove away, Elena felt a sense of completion that she had never known before. The mission was over. The bridge was held. The dam was built. She walked to her truck where Tug was waiting for her. He didn't say anything, but he reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the silvery scars on her palm. They drove away from the site, the lights of the dam fading into the darkness behind them. They were headed toward the small cabin at the end of the valley, toward the fire and the coffee and the quiet life they had built together. But Elena knew that she would be back. There were more dams to build, more bridges to fix, more structures to protect. The world would always be breaking, and she would always be there to listen to the wiring. She was Elena Vance, and she was no longer afraid of the sound. The truck climbed the final hill before the cabin, the headlights cutting through the falling snow. Elena looked out at the mountains, the jagged peaks silhouetted against the starlit sky. They looked like the teeth of the earth, strong and permanent and ancient. She felt a deep, profound connection to the land, a sense of belonging that she had never found in a barracks or a motor pool. This was her ground. This was her foundation. As they pulled into the driveway, the dog was waiting for them on the porch, his tail wagging a slow, rhythmic greeting. Elena stepped out of the truck, the cold air biting at her cheeks, and felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of hope. It was a small hope, quiet and real, like the first green shoots of spring beneath the snow. It was the hope of a woman who had survived the storm and had found the strength to keep building. She walked up the steps, her hand brushing the cedar railing she had installed herself. She felt the texture of the wood, the strength of the grain, the honesty of the material. It was a good railing. It would hold. She opened the door and walked into the warmth of the cabin, the smell of wood smoke and pine welcoming her home. She was a soldier, she was an engineer, and she was a woman who had found her own center. The wiring was quiet. The resonance was gone. Everything was in balance. She sat down by the fire, the dog at her feet and Tug beside her, and watched the flames dance in the hearth. She felt the weight of the world, but it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a responsibility she was proud to carry. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the fire wash over her. She was home. The mountains stood silent in the dark, a massive, unyielding presence that would be there long after she was gone. But for now, in this moment, she was part of them. She was the one who knew their secrets. She was the one who held them together. She was Elena Vance, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The next morning, the valley was a world of brilliant, blinding white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight. Elena stood on the porch, her coffee steaming in the cold air, and looked out at the dam. It was beautiful. A gray, elegant curve of strength and purpose, a man-made mountain in a world of giants. She felt a sudden, sharp clarity, a sense of understanding that went beyond physics or math. She realized that the wiring she had been seeing her whole life wasn't just about structures or machines. It was about people. It was about the hidden connections that held the world together, the invisible threads of loyalty and courage and truth that kept the system from unzipping. She was one of those threads. Tug was another. The woman on the bridge was another. We are the ones who hold the load, she thought. We are the ones who stay. She took a slow, deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. She felt the strength in her body, the scars on her hands, the quiet, steady beat of her heart. She was ready for whatever came next. The road was open. The foundation was solid. The world was waiting. She turned and went back inside, the door clicking shut with a sound that was both a finish and a beginning. In the high, thin air of the Bitterroot Mountains, the silence held, a perfect, resonant balance of everything that had been lost and everything that had been found. The project was finished, but the work was never done. And Elena Vance wouldn't have had it any other way. She sat at her desk and opened a new set of blueprints. A new bridge, a new valley, a new promise. The wiring was calling, and she was ready to listen. She looked at the first line of the new design, the pen steady in her scarred hand. She began to draw. The world needed to be built, and she was the one to do it. One bolt, one beam, one breath at a time. The frequency was her own. The mountains watched, silent and eternal, as the woman with the silver scars began to write the next chapter of the world. She was Elena Vance, and she was the one who stayed. The rest of the world might never know her name, but they would live in the structures she built, and they would be safe in the bridges she held. That was enough. The snow continued to fall, a quiet white shroud over the valley, but beneath it the earth was solid and the foundation was true. The 62, 4 hertz pulse was a memory. The 60 hertz hum was the present, and the future was a silent, beautiful curve of possibility. Elena Vance leaned into her work, the light from the window catching the silvery lines on her palms as she mapped out the load paths of a world that was finally at peace. The mountains didn't move, and neither did she. She was exactly where she needed to be. The blueprints were white, the ink was black, the truth was solid. The end of the story was just the beginning of the build. The dam held the water, the house held the heat, and the woman held the line.